Francisco Pizarro had 168 men when he walked into the heart of the Inca Empire to meet Atahualpa, the god emperor who commanded armies of 80,000 warriors and ruled over 12 million subjects from golden palaces high in the Andes Mountains. The Inca had never lost a battle. They had roads, advanced agriculture, and organizational systems that rivaled Rome at its peak. Pizarro was a pig farmer's son who couldn't even read. By the end of that single day, the god emperor was captured, his army was scattered, and the largest empire in the Americas was effectively finished. This is the story of how a handful of conquistadors repeatedly achieved the impossible, and the brutal genius behind their methods will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the collision between the old and new worlds. But before we dive into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please introduce yourself in the comments, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We're on to building a global community here. Thank you once more for joining me today, so without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Two worlds on the brink of collision. The year is 1491. On one side of an ocean yet unmapped by most, two kingdoms finally unite after centuries of war. On the other side, empires stretch across mountains and valleys, holding millions under their rule. Neither world knows the other exists. Within months, these two realities will collide, changing everything forever. In the final days of 1491, the city of Granada stands as the last outpost of Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula. Its rulers know the end approaches. Outside the walls, the combined armies of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile gather. These two monarchs married in 1469, binding together kingdoms that had often fought each other. Their union creates something new, a unified power with resources to pursue a singular vision. The siege begins in April. 80,000 soldiers surround the city. Artillery pounds the walls day after day. Inside, Sultan Muhammad V sends desperate messages across the sea to fellow Muslim rulers in Africa and Egypt. The responses never come. By January of 1492, he has no choice. On the second day of the new year, he rides out to surrender the keys to the Alhambra Palace. Nearly 800 years of Muslim presence in Iberia ends in a single moment. The victory releases something in Castile and Aragon. For generations, warfare against Muslim kingdoms gave purpose to the Christian nobles. Now that purpose needs a new direction. The Catholic monarchs waste no time. 3 months after Granada falls, they sign the Alhambra Decree. Every Jew in their kingdoms must convert to Christianity or leave within 4 months. Some 200,000 people face this choice. Many depart for other lands. Those who stay convert, though the Inquisition watches them with endless suspicion. This newly unified force carries specific ideas about the world. First comes God. The faith must spread. Those who reject it threaten the divine order. Second comes gold. Royal treasuries need constant filling. Wars cost money. Empires require funding. Third comes glory. Noble families seek honor through martial deeds. Younger sons inherit nothing, so they must carve out fortunes with their swords. The men who will become conquistadors grow up in this world. Many come from Extremadura, a harsh region in western Iberia. Rocky soil yields little. Opportunities remain scarce. These men learn to ride horses from childhood. They train with weapons. They hear stories of the Reconquista from their fathers and grandfathers. They know that land and wealth come to those bold enough to seize them. Technology gives them advantages. The crossbow delivers bolts with deadly force. Early firearms called arquebuses boom with smoke and fire, terrifying to those who have never heard such sounds. But perhaps their greatest advantage walks on 4 legs. Horses transform warfare. A mounted warrior towers over those on foot. He moves faster, he strikes harder. The psychological impact alone can break enemy formations. These kingdoms also carry something invisible. Diseases that have swept through European populations for centuries. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza. Generations of exposure mean many Europeans survive these illnesses. Their bodies develop resistance. They do not know this. They do not understand why some live while others perish. But they carry these invisible weapons in their blood, their breath, their touch. Across the ocean, civilizations thrive in complete ignorance of what approaches. In the Valley of Mexico, the city of Tenochtitlan rises from an island in Lake Texcoco. Founded in 1325, it has grown into one of the largest cities in the world. Estimates place its population at over 200,000 people. That makes it 5 times larger than the London of the same era. Causeways connect the island to the mainland. Aqueducts bring fresh water across the lake. Gardens float on the water, providing food for the massive population. The Aztec Empire controls this city and much more. Under the Mexica people, the empire expanded through the 15th century. By 1519, it dominates 5 to 6 million people across hundreds of smaller states. Some submit through diplomacy, others fall to conquest. All pay tribute. Gold, jade, cacao, feathers, textiles, and captives flow into Tenochtitlan. The tribute system enriches the capital while binding subject peoples to its power. Emperor Moctezuma II rules from his palace, said to have 100 rooms, each with its own bath. He commands a complex government and a powerful military. The empire's success rests on remarkable agriculture. Chinampas, the floating gardens, yield multiple harvests each year. This abundance supports dense populations and specialized workers. Priests, warriors, merchants, craftsmen, and farmers all have their place in the rigid social order. Religion shapes every aspect of life. The Great Pyramid in the city center holds temples to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and sun, and Tlaloc, god of rain. The calendar governs ritual. The cosmos must be maintained through proper ceremony. Blood sacrifice feeds the gods who keep the sun moving and the crops growing. Captives taken in war meet this sacred purpose. To the Mexica, this system makes sense. It preserves the world. Far to the south, another empire spans even greater distances. The Inca call their realm Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. From their capital at Cusco, high in the Andes Mountains, they rule between 6 and 14 million people. The empire stretches over 2,000 miles from north to south. It encompasses parts of modern Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, and Colombia, though these names mean nothing yet. The Inca achieved this without certain technologies other civilizations consider essential. They have no iron, no writing system, no currency, no wheel, yet they build the largest empire in the Americas through organization, diplomacy, and, when necessary, military force. They construct over 20,000 miles of roads across the most challenging terrain on Earth. Rope bridges span mountain gorges. Stone steps climb impossible slopes. Messages travel these routes faster than in any European postal system. Emperor Huayna Capac rules this vast domain at the empire's height. Like Moctezuma, he commands through a complex bureaucracy. The empire divides into 4 quarters, each with its own governor. Below them, provinces organize production and tribute. At the lowest level, family groups called Ailu work the land together. Each Ailu receives land based on its size and owes labor service to the state. This Mita system builds temples, roads, terraces, and irrigation works. The Inca religion centers on worship of Inti, the sun god, and Viracocha, the creator. The emperor himself descends from the sun. Magnificent temples across the empire display this devotion. The Coricancha in Cusco shimmers with gold. Priests perform divination to diagnose illness and predict war outcomes. The mummified bodies of previous emperors receive honors at festivals, paraded through the streets with their ancient treasures. Both empires stand at peaks of power, yet both face internal tensions. The Aztecs rule through fear. Subject peoples resent the endless demands for tribute and captives. Resistance simmers beneath the surface. The Spanish will later exploit these resentments with devastating effect. The Inca face different challenges. The rapid expansion has not yet fully integrated all conquered peoples. In just a few years, succession disputes will tear the empire apart. Neither civilization suspects what approaches. Stories of strange men arriving by great ships have not yet spread this far. In Caribbean islands, the first contacts have already occurred, but news travels slowly. The empires of Mexico and the Andes continue their lives, their wars, their rituals, unaware that in 1492, a Genoese sailor convinced Spanish monarchs to fund a voyage west across the ocean sea. The world of the conquistadors grows from specific circumstances. Iberian kingdoms fresh from victory and unified in purpose. Technological advantages in weapons and animals, religious fervor that justifies conquest, economic desperation that drives men to risk everything, a culture that prizes martial glory above nearly all else. These elements combine to create a particular kind of warrior, ruthless, ambitious, devoted, and utterly convinced of his right to take whatever he can seize. The American empires develop along different paths. The Aztecs build vertical power through tribute and sacrifice. The Inca spread horizontal control through roads and administration. Both create remarkable civilizations, but both also contain weaknesses that will soon be tested in ways they cannot imagine. The stage is set. The actors are in place. The collision approaches. The admiral in the first footsteps, Christopher Columbus, stands on the deck of the Santa Maria as his crew argues. The ocean stretches endlessly west. Weeks have passed since they last saw land. The men grow restless. Some whisper of mutiny. Columbus shows them his charts again. Just a few more days, he promises. The riches of the Indies lie just ahead. He is wrong about where he sails, but right that land approaches. On October 12, 1492, a lookout spots an island. They name it San Salvador. The Taino people who live there watch as strange men row ashore. These visitors wear odd clothes. They speak an unknown language. They seem particularly interested in the small gold ornaments some Taino wear. Columbus believes he has reached islands off the coast of Asia. He calls the inhabitants Indians. The name sticks despite being completely incorrect. Over the next 3 months, he explores the Caribbean, visiting several islands. Everywhere he goes, he asks about gold. The Taino point toward other islands, other peoples. They mention a place called Cibao, which Columbus hears as Cipango, the Spanish name for Japan. His excitement grows. The expedition establishes the first European settlement in the Americas at La Navidad on the island of Hispaniola. Columbus leaves 39 men there with instructions to search for gold and await his return. He takes several Taino captives and sails back to Spain, arriving in March 1493. His reports electrify the Spanish court. Gold, rich lands, peoples who seem ready to accept Christianity and Spanish rule. The Catholic monarchs immediately authorize a second, much larger expedition. Columbus returns in September 1493 with 17 ships and over 1,200 men. This time he brings soldiers, craftsmen, farmers, and priests. The goal has shifted from exploration to settlement. When they reach La Navidad, they find disaster. The settlement lies in ruins. Bodies scatter the ground. The Taino explain that the Spanish men began taking their women and gold. Violence erupted. The survivors fled inland and were hunted down. Columbus establishes a new settlement called La Isabela. Problems begin immediately. The site chosen has poor water and no natural harbor. Many men fall ill. They expected to find gold lying on the ground. Instead, they must work to clear land and build shelters. Resentment festers. Some men sailed expecting adventure and riches. They found only hard labor, disease, and hostile conditions. Some returned to Spain with bitter complaints about Columbus's leadership. The search for gold becomes desperate. Columbus implements a tribute system. Every Taino above age 14 must provide a certain amount of gold dust every 3 months. Those who comply receive a copper token to wear around their necks. Those who fail face punishment. The system is brutal. In some regions, gold simply does not exist in the quantities demanded. Taino who cannot pay have their hands removed. Others flee into the mountains. The Taino population begins to decline with terrifying speed. Diseases the Europeans bring with them spread like wildfire. Smallpox arrives first. The Taino have no immunity. Whole villages sicken and perish. Influenza follows, then measles, then typhus. Bodies pile up faster than survivors can bury them. In some areas, 90% of the population vanishes within a generation. The collapse goes beyond disease. The tribute system disrupts traditional agriculture. People flee into the forest to escape Spanish demands, leaving their fields untended. Famine spreads. Social structures break down. Women taken as concubines by Spanish settlers cannot bear and raise children in traditional ways. Birth rates plummet while death rates soar. The demographic catastrophe unfolds with devastating speed. Columbus proves himself a poor administrator. The settlers divide into factions. Some support the Columbus brothers, for Christopher's brothers Bartolomeo and Diego help govern the settlements. Others oppose them. Violence between Spanish settlers adds to the chaos. Complaints reach Spain. In 1500, Francisco de Bobadilla arrives as a royal investigator. He finds conditions so bad that he arrests Columbus and ships him back to Spain in chains. Though Columbus eventually receives a pardon, he never recovers his administrative authority. He makes 2 more voyages to the Caribbean in 1498 and 1502. But these expeditions focus on exploration rather than governance. He sails along the coast of Central America, still searching for a passage to the Asian mainland. He never accepts that he has found a new continent. He dies in 1506, convinced he reached the outskirts of Asia. His legacy is complicated. His voyages open the door to European expansion into the Americas. The exchanges that follow transform the entire world. Yet his governance brings catastrophe to the indigenous peoples he encounters. The tribute systems, the enslavement, the casual violence set templates that later conquistadors will follow and expand. On Hispaniola, the Spanish settlements slowly stabilize, gold mining operations expand, sugar plantations appear. The colonists import African slaves as the Taino population continues its collapse. Other Caribbean islands fall under Spanish control: Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico. Each conquest follows similar patterns: initial resistance, Spanish military superiority, the establishment of settlements, the imposition of tribute, the arrival of diseases, the demographic disaster. The conquistadors who will later invade the mainland cut their teeth in these Caribbean campaigns. Hernán Cortés serves in the conquest of Cuba under Diego Velázquez. Francisco Pizarro participates in expeditions to the mainland coast. These men learn important lessons. Superior weapons and horses can overcome much larger indigenous armies. Divisions among indigenous peoples can be exploited. Capturing leaders can paralyze enemy resistance. Perhaps most importantly, they learn that the rules that govern warfare in Europe do not apply here. Spanish officials in the Caribbean hear rumors of wealthy civilizations on the mainland. Indigenous people speak of great cities, powerful rulers, and vast stores of gold. Expeditions probe the coast. In 1517, Francisco Hernández de Córdoba reaches the Yucatan Peninsula. He encounters Maya peoples who possess cities, elaborate architecture, and organized military forces. The Maya drive him back with losses, but Córdoba returns to Cuba with golden objects and stories of a rich civilization. Diego Velázquez, governor of Cuba, organizes a second expedition under Juan de Grijalva in 1518. Grijalva explores further along the coast. He encounters representatives of the Aztec Empire who present gifts and ask about Spanish intentions. Grijalva returns to Cuba with more gold and more stories. The stage is set for the next phase. The age of exploration shifts toward the age of conquest. The first 25 years of Spanish presence in the Americas establish patterns that will repeat with horrifying consistency. Europeans arrive with superior military technology. They seek gold and tribute. They impose their authority through a combination of military force and strategic alliances. They bring diseases that devastate indigenous populations. They view the peoples they encounter as subjects to be converted, controlled, and exploited. On Caribbean islands, entire peoples vanish. The Taino culture that greeted Columbus in 1492 barely exists by 1520. Scholars debate the exact numbers, but the consensus suggests millions perish in just a few decades. Some die from disease, some from violence, some from the disruption of their societies, some from despair. The catastrophe is total. Yet the Spanish expansion is just beginning. The Caribbean provides a launching point for expeditions to the mainland. Men gather in Cuba, Hispaniola, and Panama, hearing stories of wealthy empires waiting to be conquered. They dream of finding another Mexico, another Peru. They imagine themselves as great conquerors, carving out kingdoms and fortunes. Many will die in the attempt. Others will succeed beyond their wildest dreams. The first footsteps have been taken. The path of the conquistadors stretches ahead, marked by ambition, faith, greed, and an ocean of blood. The conquistador profile: steel, horse, and cross. Picture a man in his 20s or 30s, dust on his boots, a sword at his hip, and hunger in his eyes. This is your typical conquistador. Not a nobleman from the great houses of Spain, not a wealthy merchant's son. More often, he comes from the lesser nobility or even from commoner stock. His prospects back home look grim. Older brothers inherit the land, the family wealth divides too many ways. So he crosses an ocean, gambling everything on a chance at glory. Extremadura provides more conquistadors than any other region of Spain. This harsh territory in the west offers little to young men with ambition. The soil yields reluctantly. Opportunities remain scarce, but the culture breeds toughness. Boys learn to ride, to fight, to endure hardship. They grow up hearing tales of the Reconquista, of ancestors who carved out fortunes by taking them from Muslim kingdoms. Now that war has ended, they need a new frontier. Hernán Cortés was born in Medellín, Extremadura in 1485. His family belonged to the minor nobility. They had status but little wealth. Francisco Pizarro, born around 1478 in Trujillo, another Extremadura town, had even less. Born illegitimate to a soldier father and a peasant mother, he spent his youth herding pigs. Both men shared the desperation that drives conquistadors. Both crossed the ocean seeking transformation. These men bring more than ambition. They bring technologies that give them shocking advantages. Start with the sword. Toledo steel becomes legendary for good reason. Spanish smiths develop techniques that produce blades harder and sharper than most other weapons. A Toledo sword, properly maintained, holds its edge through battle after battle. The conquistadors train with these weapons from youth. Swordsmanship becomes as natural as walking. The crossbow adds range and power to Spanish arsenals. A crossbow bolt punches through shields and armor that would deflect arrows. The weapon requires strength to cock, but less skill to aim than a traditional bow. A crossbowman can master his weapon in weeks rather than years. The conquistadors value this. They need every advantage they can find. The arquebus brings something entirely new to American warfare. This early firearm operates simply. Gunpowder explodes in a barrel, driving a lead ball forward with tremendous force. The weapon makes a deafening noise. It produces smoke and flame. To peoples who have never encountered gunpowder, the effect is psychologically devastating. The actual killing power matters less than the terror it creates. Spanish armor provides another edge. Steel breastplates, helmets, and chainmail turn arrows and obsidian blades that would otherwise prove fatal. The armor is hot, heavy, and uncomfortable in tropical climates. Many conquistadors abandon the heaviest pieces. But even partial armor makes a difference. It allows men to push forward through arrow storms that would stop unprotected warriors. Then there are the horses. This advantage transcends all others. The Americas have no horses when the Spanish arrive. The animals present in prehistoric times vanished thousands of years earlier. Indigenous peoples have never seen such creatures. The first encounters produce shock and terror. Some peoples initially believe horse and rider form a single being, some strange centaur god. Even after understanding that horses carry men, the advantage remains enormous. A mounted warrior moves faster than any runner. He strikes from above with devastating force. A horse can trample enemy soldiers. The animals themselves become weapons. Conquistadors breed war horses specifically for combat. They train these animals to bite and kick in battle. A handful of cavalry can break formations of thousands. War dogs add another weapon to the conquistador arsenal. Mastiffs and wolfhounds bred for size and ferocity accompany many expeditions. The Spanish train these dogs to track and attack indigenous peoples. The practice is grotesque but effective. The dogs terrorize populations already dealing with horses, guns, and steel. They hunt fugitives through forests. They guard camps at night. Some conquistadors give their dogs names and treat them as valued soldiers. Military organization matters as much as weapons. The conquistadors fight as disciplined units, using formations developed in European wars. They coordinate infantry and cavalry. They protect their flanks. They employ tactics refined over centuries. Indigenous armies, no matter how numerous or brave, often lack this level of coordination. Individual valor cannot overcome systematic military science. Yet technology alone does not explain conquistador success. These men possess a particular mindset. They believe absolutely in their cause. The Catholic faith drives them as much as gold. They see themselves as warriors of God, bringing Christianity to pagan lands. This conviction justifies any action. Warfare, enslavement, the destruction of temples and gods, all of this serves a holy purpose. The conquistadors fuse religious devotion with personal ambition in ways that seem contradictory to modern eyes. A man can pray sincerely before battle, then participate in atrocities afterward without seeing any contradiction. Faith and greed coexist. The cross and the sword march together. Converting souls and seizing gold become parts of the same mission. This psychology makes conquistadors exceptionally dangerous. They do not doubt their right to conquer. They do not question their methods. Treaties made with indigenous peoples mean nothing when gold beckons. Promises break as easily as they are given. The only law that matters is the law of force. The strongest take what they want, the weak submit or perish. Relationships between conquistadors themselves are complex. They swear loyalty to leaders, but that loyalty extends only as far as mutual benefit. When expeditions succeed, men receive shares of treasure based on their contribution. Disputes over these shares spark endless conflicts. Conquistadors turn on each other with shocking frequency. The history of Spanish conquest is also a history of Spanish civil wars. The typical conquistador expedition operates more like a business venture than a military campaign. A leader gathers investors, secures royal permission, and recruits men by promising shares of future profits. Each participant provides his own equipment. Some bring horses, others contribute weapons or supplies. A notary records these contributions, determining future shares. Contracts spell out the division of spoils. Leaders typically claim a fifth of all treasure, with the crown taking another fifth. The remainder divides among the participants based on their contribution. A man with a horse receives more than a foot soldier. An officer receives more than a common soldier. Disputes over these divisions lead to lawsuits, duels, and sometimes outright warfare. The crown attempts to regulate conquest through legal frameworks. The requerimiento, instituted in 1513, requires conquistadors to read a document to indigenous peoples before attacking. The document demands they accept Spanish sovereignty and Catholic authority. If they refuse, war becomes justified. The system is absurd. Conquistadors read the requerimiento in Spanish to peoples who understand none of it. They often read it to empty forests before attacking villages. The legal fiction matters more than the reality. Individual conquistadors vary in character. Some, like Bartolomé de las Casas, eventually develop consciences and advocate for indigenous rights. Others remain brutal throughout their careers. Most fall somewhere between these extremes. They participate in terrible actions but can convince themselves these actions serve higher purposes. They are products of their culture, their era, and their circumstances. The profile of a conquistador is ultimately a profile of contradiction. Devout yet greedy, brave yet cruel, organized yet chaotic, loyal yet treacherous. These men transform the Americas through their actions. They topple empires that dwarf their own forces. They establish Spanish dominion across a continent. They unleash demographic catastrophes. They create mestizo populations that will form new nations. They are both agents of historical transformation and very human individuals driven by recognizable motivations. Understanding them requires recognizing both their capabilities and their contradictions. The Gambit, Cortés lands in Mexico. Diego Velázquez, governor of Cuba, makes a decision he will regret. In late 1518, he chooses Hernán Cortés to lead an expedition to the mainland of Mexico. The previous two expeditions brought back gold and reports of wealthy civilizations. Velázquez wants to capitalize on this knowledge, but he needs someone ruthless enough to succeed and controllable enough to serve his interests. He believes Cortés fits this description. He is spectacularly wrong on the second count. Cortés throws himself into preparations. He spends his own fortune outfitting the expedition. He sells property. He borrows heavily. He recruits men with promises of riches. By February 1519, he has assembled 11 ships, about 500 soldiers, 100 sailors, several African slaves, 16 horses, several cannons, and numerous crossbows and arquebuses. It is a modest force to challenge an empire, but Cortés does not know what he faces. Then, Velázquez has second thoughts. Perhaps he notices Cortés spending too freely, gathering too many supporters, or acting too independently. Perhaps someone warns him that Cortés might prove difficult to control. Whatever the reason, Velázquez sends orders canceling the expedition. Cortés ignores them. He loads his ships and sails before the governor can physically stop him. This act of defiance sets the pattern for everything that follows. The fleet reaches the coast of the Yucatan in late February. They land first on the island of Cozumel, where Cortés hears of two Spaniards living among the Maya after a shipwreck 8 years earlier. He rescues one, Geronimo de Aguilar, who becomes a translator. The other, Gonzalo Guerrero, has gone native. He married a Maya woman, had children, and fights alongside the Maya against Spanish incursions. He refuses to return. Cortés finds this choice incomprehensible and offensive. The expedition continues along the coast. In March, they reach the mouth of the Tabasco River. The local Maya people, the Chontal, initially agree to trade, but then assemble warriors to drive the Spanish away. The Battle of Centla demonstrates Spanish military advantages. Cavalry charges break Maya formations. Cannons and arquebuses create panic. The Maya fight bravely but cannot overcome the technological gap. After 2 days of fighting, they sue for peace. The Chontal present tribute that includes 20 women. One of these women changes history. She comes from an Aztec region but was sold into slavery among the Maya as a child. The Spanish baptize her as Marina, though she is better known by the name Malinche. She speaks both Nahuatl, the Aztec language, and several Maya languages. Combined with Aguilar, who speaks Spanish and Maya, Cortés suddenly has the ability to communicate with the Aztec Empire. Malinche becomes far more than a translator. She becomes Cortés's advisor, interpreter of culture and politics, and eventually his mistress and mother of his son. In April, the expedition reaches the region near modern-day Veracruz. Cortés sends messengers to the Aztec emperor announcing his arrival. While waiting for responses, he meets with the local Totonac people. These meetings prove revelatory. The Totonacs hate the Aztecs. They resent the constant demands for tribute. They despise the practice of taking captives for sacrifice. They whisper of other subject peoples who share these sentiments. Cortés, through Malinche, begins to understand something crucial. The Aztec Empire is powerful but deeply resented. That resentment can be weaponized. Aztec tribute collectors arrive at a Totonac town while Cortés is present. Cortés convinces the Totonacs to seize and imprison these officials. This act stuns everyone. No one defies Aztec authority so openly. But Cortés is not finished with his manipulations. In secret, he releases the prisoners and tells them he knew nothing of their capture. He sends them back to Moctezuma with messages of friendship. He plays both sides brilliantly. The Totonacs, having publicly defied the Aztecs, have no choice but to ally with the Spanish. They provide warriors, supplies, and invaluable intelligence about Aztec military strength and political divisions. 20 Totonac towns formally ally with Cortés. This pattern of finding and exploiting indigenous allies becomes the key to Spanish success. Meanwhile, Moctezuma receives report after report about the strangers. His messengers bring detailed descriptions: floating houses on the water, animals like small mountains carrying men, sticks that belch fire and thunder. The emperor finds these reports deeply troubling. Aztec prophecies speak of the god Quetzalcoatl's return from the east. Some of Moctezuma's advisors suggest these might be supernatural beings rather than humans. The emperor sends rich gifts and messages asking the strangers to leave. Cortés interprets the gifts as signs of even greater wealth ahead. Cortés faces a problem. He has defied Velázquez and essentially stolen this expedition. If he returns to Cuba with moderate success, he faces arrest and punishment. He must succeed spectacularly or not at all. He also worries about dissension in his ranks. Some men remain loyal to Velázquez, others question the wisdom of marching inland to confront an empire. Cortés needs to make turning back impossible. In June, he orders his ships run aground and stripped of useful materials. The ships are not exactly burned, as later legends claim, but they are rendered unusable. The message to his men is clear. There is no escape. Victory or annihilation are the only options. Some accounts suggest his men protest, others suggest they understand the necessity. Either way, the decision binds them to their leader's fate. Before marching inland, Cortés establishes the town of Villarica de la Vera Cruz. He has the settlement formally founded by a town council, which then elects him as chief justice and captain general. These legal maneuvers, however dubious, give him authority independent from Velázquez. He writes letters directly to King Charles V, explaining his actions and requesting royal recognition. He sends a ship with these letters and a fifth of the treasure collected so far. The ship slips past Cuba, avoiding Velázquez's clutches. In August 1519, Cortés begins his march inland with about 400 Spanish soldiers, 15 horses, several small cannons, and thousands of Totonac allies. They march toward the great city of Tenochtitlan without knowing exactly what they will find there. They know only that a wealthy emperor rules from a magnificent capital somewhere in the mountains. They have committed themselves to conquering an empire about which they know almost nothing. The trek inland is brutal. The coastal lowlands give way to mountains. The army climbs through pine forests into high-altitude cold. Many Totonac warriors accustomed to tropical heat suffer from the temperature drop. They reach Tlaxcala, a powerful state that has remained independent from the Aztecs. The Tlaxcalans initially attack the Spanish, testing their strength. Cortés fights several battles, demonstrating Spanish military prowess. Then he shifts to diplomacy. The Tlaxcalans face a choice. They have resisted Aztec domination for decades. They hate Moctezuma. These strangers offer an alliance against their ancient enemy. Can they trust the Spanish? The debates among Tlaxcalan leaders grow heated. Some argue for destroying the invaders immediately. Others suggest using them against the Aztecs. In the end, pragmatism wins. Thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors join Cortés. This alliance proves decisive. Without Tlaxcalan support, the Spanish would likely have perished in the mountains. The army marches to Cholula, a city of perhaps 100,000 people. Cholula maintains an alliance with the Aztecs. Cortés, warned by Malinche of a possible trap, strikes first. In what becomes known as the Cholula Massacre, Spanish and Tlaxcalan forces attack without warning. They occupy the main plaza, trap thousands of Cholulans inside, and systematically eliminate them. Estimates suggest 3,000 to 6,000 perish in a few hours. Cortés justifies the act as preemptive defense. To the Aztecs, it demonstrates Spanish ruthlessness. Moctezuma receives reports of the massacre with growing alarm. His military advisors urge him to mobilize the full imperial army and crush these invaders in the mountain passes. But Moctezuma hesitates. Is this really necessary? Might diplomacy succeed? Perhaps these strangers can be persuaded to leave peacefully. He sends more gifts and more messages. Each gift only makes Cortés more determined to reach the source of such wealth. In November 1519, the Spanish army begins its final approach to Tenochtitlan. They march along the causeway that connects the island city to the mainland. On both sides, the lake spreads away. Canoes dot the water. The city rises before them, its pyramids and palaces gleaming white. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a conquistador who later writes his memoirs, reports that the soldiers stand amazed. Some wonder if they are dreaming or under an enchantment. They have seen nothing like this city in their lives. Cortés has achieved something remarkable. He traveled hundreds of miles through hostile territory. He convinced powerful indigenous states to ally with him. He reached the Aztec capital not as a fugitive, but as the leader of an army. He did this with fewer than 500 Spanish soldiers against an empire of millions. The gambit paid off. But the truly difficult part lies ahead. Getting into Tenochtitlan proves much easier than getting out will be. The march inland and the city of dreams. The causeway seems endless, water on both sides, canoes everywhere. Thousands of Aztec citizens line the route, watching the strangers march toward their city. Hernán Cortés sits astride his horse, projecting confidence he may not entirely feel. His 400 Spaniards and several thousand indigenous allies move in formation. Every man understands the precariousness of their situation. One destroyed bridge behind them, and they become trapped on an island in the middle of a lake, surrounded by an empire of millions. Then Emperor Moctezuma appears. He arrives in a litter, carried by nobles and shaded by a canopy of feathers and gold. The most powerful man in Mexico steps down to meet this strange foreign captain. The two leaders exchange gifts and formal greetings through interpreters. Moctezuma offers Cortés a necklace of golden shrimp. Cortés presents a necklace of cut glass that he attempts to place around the emperor's neck himself. Attendants intervene, horrified. No one touches the sacred person of the emperor. The awkwardness of this first meeting captures the vast gulf between these two cultures. Moctezuma embodies divine authority. His subjects do not look directly at him. They approach crawling. They speak in formal, ritual language. Cortés sees a monarch, but not one who outranks European kings in his mind. He treats Moctezuma as an equal or even a subordinate. The arrogance is breathtaking, but it also unsettles the Aztecs. These strangers respect no social boundaries. Moctezuma provides the Spanish with the palace of his father, Axayacatl, for their quarters. The location is central, large enough to house the Spanish force and their horses. It also sits near the center of power, where Moctezuma can keep watch on these troublesome guests. For the Spanish, the accommodations exceed their wildest dreams. Spacious rooms, gardens, fine food delivered daily. The emperor sends dancers and entertainers. He grants Cortés audiences where they discuss their respective kingdoms through interpreters. But the Spanish explore their quarters and discover something that changes everything. Behind a sealed wall, they find Moctezuma's treasure rooms. Gold worked into masks, jewelry, figurines, plates, jade carvings, turquoise mosaics, feather capes of stunning artistry. The wealth staggers them. Bernal Diaz writes that they stand amazed, hardly believing what they see. They have found what they crossed an ocean to find. The days that follow establish a strange routine. Moctezuma visits the Spanish quarters. Cortés visits the emperor's palace. They exchange gifts. Cortés preaches Christianity. Moctezuma explains Aztec beliefs. Tours of the city are arranged. The Spanish marvel at the markets where tens of thousands gather to trade. They visit the Great Pyramid and recoil at the blood-stained altars. They see the zoo where Moctezuma keeps jaguars, eagles, and snakes. They walk through botanical gardens displaying plants from across the empire. Tenochtitlan's magnificence cannot be overstated. The city surpasses most European capitals in size, organization, and public services. A system of aqueducts brings fresh water from mountain springs. A network of canals allows transport throughout the island. Public services employ thousands. Workers sweep the streets daily. Waste disposal follows organized systems. Public latrines service the population. The Spanish, coming from cities where sewage runs in the streets, find this cleanliness remarkable. The main marketplace at Tlatelolco operates daily, but every fifth day becomes a major market day, drawing perhaps 50,000 people. Goods arrive from across the empire: cacao from the tropical coasts, obsidian from the volcanic highlands, cotton textiles, pottery, foodstuffs of every description. Judges sit in the market to resolve disputes. Notaries record transactions. The organization rivals any European market and exceeds most. The Aztec engineering achievements impress even the skeptical Spanish. The city stands on an island in a salt lake, yet its residents have fresh water. The solution involves not only aqueducts, but also the careful management of springs and the construction of separating salt water from fresh. The chinampas, or floating gardens, maximize agricultural production. These rectangular plots created from lake-bottom mud yield 3 or 4 harvests annually. Yet beneath the beauty and sophistication runs a current that disturbs the Spanish. Human sacrifice occurs regularly. The conquistadors witness ceremonies where captives climb temple stairs to their deaths. Priests open chests with obsidian blades, removing still beating hearts to offer the gods. Skulls line racks near the temples. The Spanish count thousands. To the Aztecs, this practice sustains the cosmos. To the Spanish, it confirms that these people require salvation and conquest. Cortés and his officers understand their precarious situation. They stand in the heart of a vast empire, vastly outnumbered, with their escape route easily severed. Moctezuma remains friendly, but also inscrutable. Does he plan treachery? Will he mobilize his armies? The uncertainty gnaws at them. They discuss options. Some suggest retreating while they can. Others advocate striking first. During one of Moctezuma's visits, Cortés makes a bold and desperate move. He accuses the emperor of ordering an attack on Spanish soldiers in Veracruz. The charge has some basis. Spanish soldiers left on the coast recently fought with local peoples. Cortés claims Moctezuma directed this attack. The emperor denies it. Cortés then makes his demand. Moctezuma must move into the Spanish quarters as a guest for his own protection and to demonstrate his innocence. The scene becomes tense. Aztec nobles reach for weapons. Spanish soldiers grip sword hilts. The entire conquest hangs in the balance. If fighting erupts now, the Spanish will likely perish. But Moctezuma, incredibly, agrees. He says he will come willingly to avoid bloodshed. Whether he believes he can control the situation or fears immediate violence, his decision stuns everyone. Moctezuma moves into the palace with the Spanish. The fiction maintains that he comes as a guest, not a prisoner. He continues to govern. He receives visitors. He conducts ceremonies. But Spanish guards watch his movements. Cortés controls who sees him and when. The emperor of the Aztecs becomes a hostage in his own city, and somehow the populace accepts this situation, at least initially. For several months, this bizarre arrangement continues. Moctezuma governs through Spanish filters. Cortés extracts more and more gold, claiming it as gifts, but really demanding tribute. Aztec nobles grow increasingly restless. They see their emperor controlled by foreigners. They debate whether to act. Some urge removing Moctezuma and replacing him with a stronger leader. Others fear civil war will weaken them more than foreign occupation. Cortés uses this time to consolidate control. He demands that subject cities send representatives to Tenochtitlan to swear loyalty to the Spanish king. He forces Moctezuma to gather more treasure from across the empire. The gold accumulates. The Spanish melt down artistic masterpieces into ingots for easier transport. Artifacts that took master craftsmen months to create become raw metal weighed and divided. Then news arrives that destroys this delicate balance. A Spanish fleet has landed at Veracruz. Diego Velázquez, furious at Cortés's betrayal, sent a much larger force to arrest the renegade captain. Panfilo de Narvaez commands this force. He brings over 1,000 Spanish soldiers, nearly 3 times the number Cortés has. Narvaez carries legal documents demanding Cortés's arrest and return to Cuba in chains. Cortés faces disaster. If he stays in Tenochtitlan, Narvaez will march inland and either attack or negotiate directly with Moctezuma. If he marches to confront Narvaez, he must leave the Aztec capital with only a portion of his forces, risking uprising behind him. But Cortés did not come this far to submit meekly. He decides on bold action. He will march to the coast and defeat Velázquez's force before it becomes organized. Cortés leaves Pedro de Alvarado in command of Tenochtitlan with about 80 Spanish soldiers and a few hundred Tlaxcalan allies. He takes the remainder and marches quickly to the coast. Along the way, he sends messages to Narvaez's men, offering them better shares of Mexican gold than Velázquez promised. He bribes Narvaez's officers. He sows dissension in the enemy ranks. When Cortés attacks Narvaez's camp at night, the assault achieves total surprise. Narvaez loses an eye in the fighting. His men, many already sympathetic to Cortés's promises, surrender quickly. Cortés turns defeat into victory by incorporating nearly all of Narvaez's force into his own. He suddenly commands over 1,300 Spanish soldiers. The reversal is complete. But during his absence, disaster unfolds in Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs plan a major festival, the celebration of Toxcatl, honoring their gods with dancing and ceremony. Alvarado, nervous about the large gathering and perhaps suspecting conspiracy, orders his men to attack. Spanish soldiers seal the exits to the courtyard where the ceremony occurs and systematically cut down the unarmed participants. The massacre triggers exactly what Alvarado feared. The city erupts in fury. Aztec warriors mobilize. They attack the Spanish quarters. They cut the causeways, trapping the Spanish on the island. They stop delivering food and water. The siege begins. Alvarado and his men barricade themselves in the palace, fighting off constant attacks. They have enough Spanish soldiers and indigenous allies to avoid being immediately overrun, but their situation grows desperate. Cortés receives word of the uprising as he marches back from the coast with his enlarged force. He hurries toward Tenochtitlan, but the situation there deteriorates daily. When he finally fights his way back into the city in late June 1520, he finds his men besieged, short on supplies, and demoralized. The Aztecs allow his entry, recognizing they can trap the entire Spanish force more easily than just Alvarado's contingent. Cortés tries to salvage the situation through Moctezuma. He brings the emperor to the palace roof to address his people, to call for peace and negotiation. But Moctezuma no longer commands respect or obedience. The nobles have chosen his brother, Cuitlahuac, as the new leader. When Moctezuma appears and begins speaking, his own people respond with stones and arrows. Several strike him. He suffers injuries that will prove mortal, though accounts differ on exactly how he dies. Some Spanish sources claim he dies from his wounds. Indigenous accounts suggest the Spanish ended his life when he no longer served their purposes. With Moctezuma gone and the city in full revolt, Cortés has no choice. The Spanish must flee or perish. He plans a breakout for the night of June 30th, 1520. The Spanish call it La Noche Triste, the Night of Tears. Loaded with as much gold as they can carry, the conquistadors attempt to escape across the causeways under cover of darkness. But Aztec scouts detect them. Alarm drums sound. Warriors pour onto the causeways from all directions. Canoes swarm in the lake on both sides. The battle becomes a rout. Spanish soldiers, weighted down with gold, fall into the lake and drown. Horses panic and plunge into the water. The Aztecs drag off Spanish soldiers for later sacrifice. The portable bridge the Spanish built to cross gaps in the causeway becomes jammed with bodies and abandoned equipment. Men fight hand to hand in the darkness. The lake runs red. By dawn, the survivors reach the mainland. Cortés regroups his forces and discovers the magnitude of the disaster. Estimates suggest over half his Spanish soldiers perished. Most of the horses are gone. Nearly all the treasure is lost. Hundreds of Tlaxcalan allies died. The wounded can barely walk. Cortés reportedly weeps beneath a tree as he comprehends the catastrophe. The gambit that brought him into Tenochtitlan has led to disaster. The city of dreams became a city of nightmares. The first attempt to conquer the Aztec Empire has failed spectacularly. The night of tears, La Noche Triste. The survivors stumble through the pre-dawn darkness, bleeding, exhausted, traumatized. Aztec warriors pursue them, picking off stragglers. The Spanish and their indigenous allies have nowhere to go but east, back toward Tlaxcala. They must cover over 60 miles of hostile territory while wounded, without supplies, and constantly harried by enemy forces. Many will not make it. Cortés attempts to maintain order, but his army verges on collapse. Men who crossed an ocean seeking gold now care only about survival. They drink from polluted streams and fall sick. They eat whatever they can forage. The wounded develop infections. Some simply lie down and die from exhaustion and despair. Officers threaten and cajole, trying to keep the column moving. The Aztecs shadow them constantly. Small groups of warriors dart in to strike at the flanks. They shoot arrows from tree lines. They roll rocks down on the column from hills. Each attack claims more lives. The Spanish horses, those few that survived, grow lame from wounds and the hard march. The Spanish quickly learn that retreat can be as deadly as battle. On July 7th, about a week after the flight from Tenochtitlan, the battered army reaches a plain near Otumba. There, assembled and waiting, stands the main Aztec army. Tens of thousands of warriors in battle array. Banners and standards wave, war drums thunder. The Aztec commanders have planned this confrontation carefully. They will annihilate the Spanish here, far from any allies or refuge. The Spanish face their final crisis. They can neither retreat nor evade. Too exhausted to flee, too few to prevail, they must somehow fight their way through an army that outnumbers them by factors of 100 to 1. Cortés later writes that he commended his soul to God, expecting to die that day. Many of his men surely do the same. But the Spanish possess advantages even in extremity. They fight with the desperation of men who know surrender means sacrifice on Aztec altars. Their remaining cavalry, perhaps a dozen horses, can still charge. Their steel weapons still cut. Their discipline still holds. And they have one more advantage. Indigenous armies traditionally collapse when their leaders fall. Cortés spots the Aztec commander beneath elaborate banners. He gathers his remaining cavalry and charges directly toward that point. The horsemen smash through the Aztec ranks, focusing entirely on reaching the commander. They cut down his guards. A Spanish sword strikes the commander down. His banner falls. The moment that standard drops, the Aztec army hesitates. Confusion ripples through their ranks. The unified force begins to fragment. The Spanish exploit this opening ruthlessly. They press the attack where the Aztecs waver. Indigenous allies who have been fighting alongside the Spanish rally. The battle that seemed lost somehow shifts. The Aztecs fall back. The retreat becomes a rout. By afternoon, the Spanish hold the field. They have won not through superior numbers, but through focused violence and the accident of killing the right man at the right moment. The victory at Otumba saves the expedition, but solves nothing. The Spanish still have over 40 miles to reach Tlaxcala. They still lack supplies. They still have hundreds of wounded, but they have bought themselves time and momentum. They push on. 3 days later, they stagger into Tlaxcalan territory. Scouts go ahead to announce their arrival and request aid. The Tlaxcalans face a decision. These Spanish allies just suffered catastrophic defeat. Their aura of invincibility is shattered. They lost most of their treasure, weapons, and men. Supporting them further seems like backing a losing cause. Some Tlaxcalan nobles argue for switching sides, making peace with the Aztecs, and perhaps even helping to finish off the Spanish remnants. But other Tlaxcalans remember generations of war against the Aztecs. They remember the tribute demands, the captives taken for sacrifice, the constant pressure from Tenochtitlan. The Spanish may be weakened, but they are still dangerous. More importantly, they are the enemy of Tlaxcala's enemy. That calculus ultimately determines the decision. The Tlaxcalans reaffirm their alliance. They provide shelter, food, and medical care for the survivors. The Spanish spend months in Tlaxcala recovering. Cortés treats wounds, physical and psychological. He writes letters to Spain explaining the situation and requesting reinforcements. He sends messengers to Veracruz, ordering that every arriving Spanish ship be redirected to support his campaign. He rebuilds his force man by man, weapon by weapon. Critically, he begins planning the next assault. La Noche Triste taught bitter lessons. The causeways make Tenochtitlan nearly impregnable from land assault. The Spanish need control of the lake. So Cortés orders the construction of brigantines, small sailing ships that can be disassembled, carried overland, and reassembled at Lake Texcoco. These ships will allow him to cut Tenochtitlan's supply lines and prevent escape by water. Spanish reinforcements begin arriving. News of Mexican gold has spread through the Caribbean. Men flock to join the expedition despite the recent disaster. By late 1520, Cortés commands more Spanish soldiers than before La Noche Triste. He also recruits tens of thousands more indigenous allies. Tlaxcala provides the core, but cities across the region send contingents. The coalition against the Aztecs grows formidable. Meanwhile, in Tenochtitlan, a different disaster unfolds. Smallpox, carried by the Spanish, spreads through the city. The disease that killed Columbus in the Caribbean now reaches the mainland. The Aztecs have no immunity, no experience with this illness, no treatments that work. People fall sick by the thousands. Symptoms appear: fever, pustules covering the body. Many who contract the disease perish within days. The epidemic strikes all levels of society. In October 1520, just 4 months after driving out the Spanish, Emperor Cuitlahuac falls ill and dies. The speed of his death after achieving victory seems almost supernatural. The Aztecs choose his nephew, Cuauhtémoc, as the new emperor. Young, brave, and utterly determined to resist, Cuauhtémoc prepares the city for siege. The disease continues its spread beyond Tenochtitlan. It follows trade routes throughout Mexico and beyond. Whole villages lose half their population. Social structures strain and break. Agriculture suffers as farmers fall sick during planting or harvest. The demographic catastrophe that began in the Caribbean now engulfs the mainland. Even without Spanish military action, indigenous populations begin their collapse. Cortés uses the respite to secure his position legally and militarily. He receives word that his letters to Spain reached King Charles V. The king, impressed by the wealth sent and the scale of the opportunity, grants Cortés official authority over the conquest. This royal recognition undermines Velázquez's claims. Cortés transforms from renegade to royal servant. He also continues diplomatic offensives. Messengers go to cities throughout the region, offering alliance or threatening destruction. Some cities, seeing Aztec weakness and Spanish resurgence, switch sides. Others remain loyal to Tenochtitlan. The political map of central Mexico becomes incredibly complex. Every city calculates its best path forward in the emerging conflict. By December 1520, Cortés feels ready to advance. His forces move systematically through the Valley of Mexico, conquering cities loyal to the Aztecs. Each victory brings more indigenous allies and more supplies. The brigantines take shape under Spanish supervision. Tlaxcalan carpenters work alongside Spanish shipwrights. The vessels slowly come together. The Spanish establish a base at Texcoco, the second city of the empire, which defects to the Spanish cause. From there, they command the eastern shore of Lake Texcoco. They cut the aqueduct bringing fresh water to Tenochtitlan. They raid towns supplying food to the capital. The noose tightens gradually but inexorably. In April 1521, the brigantines are completed. 13 vessels, each with cannons and room for Spanish soldiers and indigenous rowers. They are carried in pieces to the lake, reassembled, and launched. For the first time, the Spanish control the waters around Tenochtitlan. The city is isolated. No supplies enter. No reinforcements arrive. The siege begins in earnest. The lessons of La Noche Triste shape Spanish strategy. No more attempts to hold the city through political maneuvering. No more reliance on puppet rulers. This time, the conquest will be total. Cortés divides his forces, assigning contingents to each causeway. He coordinates land and water assaults. The brigantines prevent Aztec canoes from resupplying or reinforcing defenders. The Spanish begin their slow advance into the city. The Night of Tears becomes a memory driving Spanish determination. Every man remembers the terror of that flight, the friends who drowned in the lake, the treasure lost. The desire for revenge and vindication becomes as powerful as the lust for gold. They will take this city or die trying. The failure of 1520 will be redeemed in 1521, no matter the cost. The stage is set for one of the most brutal sieges in history. The Siege and the Fall of Tenochtitlan, May 1521. The brigantines sail the waters of Lake Texcoco, cutting off any supplies trying to reach Tenochtitlan. Spanish and indigenous forces occupy all the causeways leading to the island city. Over 100,000 warriors surround a population of perhaps 200,000 civilians and soldiers. The siege has begun. Cortés divides his Spanish soldiers into three main groups, each assigned to a causeway. Pedro de Alvarado, despite his role in triggering the disaster at the Toxcatl Festival, commands the western approach. Cristobal de Olid holds the northern route. Gonzalo de Sandoval takes the southern causeway. Cortés himself maintains a mobile reserve and commands the brigantines. Each Spanish contingent includes thousands of indigenous allies. The scale of the operation dwarfs typical Spanish expeditions. The Aztecs under Emperor Cuauhtémoc prepare for prolonged resistance. They stockpile weapons, they fortify positions throughout the city, they dig channels to block Spanish advances, they prepare fire arrows, stones, and obsidian-tipped spears. Most crucially, they fill the canals crossing the causeways with debris, forcing the Spanish to clear or fill each gap before advancing. The Spanish strategy combines siege tactics with systematic destruction. They advance slowly up the causeways, fighting for every position. When they capture a section of causeway or part of the city, they fill in the canals behind them. This prevents the Aztecs from cutting their escape route as happened during La Noche Triste. It also creates a solid road for retreat if necessary. The work progresses slowly, measured in yards per day rather than miles. The brigantines prove decisive. Aztec canoes attempt to resupply the city by water. The Spanish ships intercept them. The brigantines carry cannons that sink the lighter indigenous craft. Their sails allow them to maneuver in ways paddle-powered canoes cannot match. Within weeks, the Spanish control the entire lake. Tenochtitlan becomes completely isolated. Hunger begins to affect the defenders. The city normally receives daily supplies from surrounding regions. The Chinampas provide vegetables, but not enough for the entire population. Protein comes from fish, waterfowl, and dogs, but these sources cannot sustain hundreds of thousands. Stored maize depletes. People begin eating tree bark, leather, anything with substance. Children and the elderly weaken first. Cuauhtémoc refuses surrender offers. Messages pass between him and Cortés. The Spanish promise to spare the city if the Aztecs submit. Cuauhtémoc responds that his people will die fighting rather than accept Spanish rule. His determination inspires the defenders, but also ensures their destruction. A negotiated surrender might save lives and infrastructure. Cuauhtémoc chooses honor and resistance instead. The fighting follows a pattern. Each day, Spanish forces advance into the city. They use cannons to breach barricades. They fight building by building, street by street. The Aztecs defend fiercely, counterattacking whenever possible. They lure Spanish soldiers into traps. They drop stones from rooftops. They fight with obsidian, clubs, spears, and desperate courage. At night, both sides retreat to their fortified positions. The next day, the same brutal process repeats. The Spanish employ systematic terror. When they capture a neighborhood, they burn it. Buildings that took generations to construct turn to ash in hours. They destroy temples, palaces, and common dwellings without distinction. Cortés orders this destruction to crush Aztec morale and prevent reoccupation. The policy works tactically, but turns the war into a campaign of annihilation. Atrocities multiply. Spanish soldiers and their allies sack captured areas, taking what little food remains and ending the lives of those who cannot flee. The Aztecs sacrifice captured Spanish soldiers in sight of their comrades, displaying the bodies on temple platforms. Each side's brutality escalates in response to the others. The siege becomes a descent into savagery. The brigantines conduct operations on the lake and along the canals. They fire cannons at Aztec positions. They transport troops to different parts of the city. They prevent any attempt at evacuation or escape. The Spanish use them to project power across the entire battlefield. Without the ships, Tenochtitlan might have held out much longer. By June, parts of Tenochtitlan lie in ruins. The Spanish control perhaps a third of the city. But Aztec resistance shows no signs of breaking. They withdraw into the remaining districts and fight on. Casualties mount on both sides. Spanish soldiers fall to Aztec obsidian clubs. Indigenous allies die in the narrow streets. The Aztecs suffer terribly. Disease, starvation, and warfare claim thousands weekly. The Spanish nearly face disaster in late June. Aztec warriors ambush a Spanish contingent, capturing over 60 soldiers alive. The prisoners are dragged to the main temple. The Spanish watch helplessly as their comrades are sacrificed. The Aztecs throw the severed heads back towards Spanish lines. They beat drums fashioned from Spanish horses. The psychological impact almost breaks Spanish morale. Some soldiers advocate immediate retreat. Cortés rallies his men with promises of victory and warnings about the fate awaiting them if they flee. Where would they go? The entire region is hostile. They must win or perish. He also knows that time works against the Aztecs more than the Spanish. Hunger grows worse daily inside the city. Disease continues spreading. The defenders weaken, while Spanish forces receive supplies and reinforcements from the coast. July brings intensified fighting. The Spanish push deeper into the city. They capture the marketplace at Tlatelolco, the center of Aztec economic life. They occupy the causeways completely, eliminating any Aztec escape routes. The defenders compress into a few districts. Tens of thousands of civilians huddle with the remaining warriors. Food is virtually gone. Water with the aqueduct cut comes only from limited wells. Sanitation collapses. The dead lie unburied. Cuauhtémoc tries one final gambit. He sends messengers to cities on the shore, begging for relief attacks. If forces can strike the Spanish from behind, perhaps the siege could be broken. Some cities respond. Small attacks hit Spanish positions. But these efforts lack coordination and strength. The Spanish quickly defeat them. No relief comes. Tenochtitlan stands alone. By early August, the situation inside the city becomes unsustainable. The Spanish control about 90% of Tenochtitlan. The remaining defenders hold a few neighborhoods, packed with survivors. The stench of death fills the air. Bodies float in the canals. Disease spreads unchecked. Those still alive are skeletal from starvation. Yet Cuauhtémoc refuses to surrender. Cortés offers terms repeatedly. He promises to spare those who submit. He pledges to respect Aztec nobles who accept Spanish sovereignty. These offers might be sincere or might be tactical lies. Cuauhtémoc rejects them regardless. He has watched the Spanish burn his city district by district. He has seen them end lives without mercy. He doubts their promises. He chooses to fight until nothing remains. August 13, 1521. The Spanish make their final assault. The last Aztec positions collapse under coordinated attack. Warriors fight to the end. Some throw down their weapons and prostrate themselves. Others leap into canals to avoid capture. Women and children hide in buildings, hoping to survive. The brigantines patrol the lake, capturing canoes trying to escape. Cuauhtémoc attempts to flee by canoe with his family and remaining nobles. A brigantine spots them and gives chase. Spanish soldiers capture the emperor and bring him before Cortés. The young Aztec leader, perhaps 25 years old, expects death. Instead, Cortés greets him with respect, at least initially. Cuauhtémoc requests that he be put to death immediately, saying he has failed his people and his gods. Cortés refuses. He has plans for his captive. The city falls completely. Spanish and indigenous forces pour into the remaining districts. What follows is beyond horrific. 3 days of unrestrained violence and plunder. Soldiers search every building for treasure and captives. The indigenous allies take revenge for generations of Aztec domination. The Spanish seek gold, women, and vengeance. The remaining population suffers terribly. Estimates suggest tens of thousands perish in the final assault and its aftermath. Cortés tries to stop the worst excesses, but with limited success. His soldiers and allies are beyond control after months of brutal warfare. They take what they want. The gold the Spanish find disappoints them. The Aztecs hid or disposed of much of their treasure. What remains falls short of expectations. Frustration leads to torture of prisoners, hoping to learn where more gold might be hidden. The fall of Tenochtitlan marks the effective end of the Aztec Empire. The city that amazed the Spanish just 19 months earlier lies in ruins. The empire that dominated millions is decapitated. The siege cost perhaps 100,000 lives, mostly Aztec. The survivors scatter or submit to Spanish rule. The conquest is essentially complete, though resistance will continue for years in outlying regions. Cortés establishes his authority over the ruins. He keeps Cuauhtémoc alive but captive, using him to order remaining Aztec forces to surrender. He organizes the Spanish and indigenous forces into a government. He assigns encomiendas, grants giving conquistadors rights to indigenous labor and tribute in specific regions. He begins planning the reconstruction of the city as Mexico City, capital of New Spain. The siege of Tenochtitlan demonstrates both Spanish strengths and the particular circumstances that made their conquests possible. Superior military technology helped, but not enough to explain success. The key factors were indigenous allies providing the bulk of military force, diseases weakening defenders, political divisions among indigenous peoples, and Spanish ruthlessness that embraced total war without hesitation. Remove any of these factors, and the outcome might have been different. But together, they proved overwhelming. The city of dreams became a city of ruins. The empire that seemed eternal lasted barely a generation after Spanish arrival. The conquest of Mexico is complete. The other Mexico, conquest of the Maya world. While Cortés fought in the Valley of Mexico, other Spanish expeditions probed the Yucatan Peninsula. The Maya there lived differently than the Aztecs. No single empire unified them. Instead, numerous city-states competed and cooperated in complex patterns. This fragmentation made them harder to conquer. No single victory could decapitate Maya resistance. Each city-state required separate subjugation. The Spanish first encountered Maya civilization in 1517 when Francisco Hernández de Córdoba explored the Yucatan coast. His expedition landed at several points, seeking water and supplies. At each landing, Maya warriors drove them back. Unlike Caribbean peoples, the Maya were organized, well-armed, and aggressive. They used obsidian-edged war clubs, spears, and bows. They fought in formation. They inflicted significant casualties on the Spanish before the expedition withdrew to Cuba. Córdoba returned with reports that complicated Spanish understanding. Yes, the Maya had cities, gold, and civilization, but they also had military capacity to resist. They would not submit easily. The expedition lost nearly half its men to battle and disease. Córdoba himself died from his wounds shortly after reaching Cuba. The Maya made a clear statement. They would defend their lands. Juan de Grijalva explored the coast more successfully in 1518. He avoided major battles, focusing on trade and reconnaissance. He encountered representatives of the Aztec Empire who presented gifts and gathered intelligence. Grijalva saw Maya cities from the water, noting their size and organization. He collected gold through trade rather than conquest. His expedition returned to Cuba with valuable information, but also confirmation that conquering this region would require substantial effort. The Spanish then focused on Mexico under Cortés. The conquest of the Aztecs took precedence. Only after Tenochtitlan fell did Spanish attention fully return to the Maya lands. In 1524, Cortés sent Pedro de Alvarado to conquer the highland Maya of what would become Guatemala. Alvarado, brutal even by conquistador standards, approached the campaign with characteristic ruthlessness. The highland Maya consisted of several powerful kingdoms, primarily the Quiche and Caciquel. These peoples possessed military traditions and organized armies. They initially fought the Spanish, meeting them in open battle. At the Battle of Quetzaltenango, Alvarado faced thousands of Quiche warriors. The Spanish cavalry and indigenous allies from central Mexico provided the usual advantages. The Quiche suffered severe losses. Their principal leader perished in the fighting. But unlike the Aztecs, Maya defeat in one battle did not end resistance. Other Maya kingdoms continued fighting. The Caciquel initially allied with the Spanish against their Quiche rivals. This alliance helped Alvarado establish control. But when the Spanish demanded excessive tribute and labor, the Caciquel rebelled. Alvarado spent years suppressing revolts and establishing tenuous control. The Yucatan Peninsula presented even greater challenges. In 1527, Francisco de Montejo received a charter to conquer the region. He landed with about 400 soldiers and began the campaign. The Maya greeted him with sustained resistance. Multiple city-states coordinated their defense. The Spanish established a few settlements but could not expand their control. Disease, heat, and constant warfare eroded Montejo's forces. By 1528, Montejo withdrew. The expedition achieved nothing except demonstrating Maya determination and capacity. Montejo tried again in 1531 from the west coast. This attempt also failed. The Maya employed guerrilla tactics, harassing Spanish forces while avoiding decisive battles. They poisoned water supplies. They burned their own fields to deny the Spanish food. They ambushed isolated groups. The Spanish could win battles but could not hold territory. The Maya had advantages that other indigenous peoples lacked. The terrain favored defenders. Dense jungle made cavalry charges difficult. The hot, humid climate sapped Spanish strength while natives adapted to it from birth. The decentralized political structure meant no single victory could break Maya power. Most importantly, the Maya learned from Spanish tactics and adapted their own strategies. The conquest of the Maya became a generational project. Francisco de Montejo eventually passed the task to his son, also named Francisco de Montejo. The son, sometimes called El Mozo, or the Younger, continued the campaign in the 1540s. He established settlements in northern Yucatan, including Mérida in 1542 and Campeche in 1540. These cities served as bases for gradual expansion. The younger Montejo employed different tactics than early conquistadors. He relied more on alliances with some Maya groups against others. He exploited existing rivalries. He established Spanish presence gradually rather than attempting swift conquest. The approach worked slowly. Year by year, Spanish control expanded. But even by 1546, when the Montejo family claimed conquest complete, many Maya regions remained effectively independent. The southern lowlands of the Yucatan, the region of Payton, resisted even longer. The Itza Maya maintained their capital at Tayasal, an island city in Lake Petén Itza. The Spanish made several attempts to conquer this region but failed each time. The jungle swallowed expeditions. Diseases claimed more Spanish lives than warfare. Supply lines stretched impossibly long. The Itza Maya maintained independence until 1697, over 170 years after the first Spanish contact. This prolonged resistance distinguishes the Maya from the Aztecs and Incas. No swift conquest brought their civilizations low. Instead, decades of grinding warfare, negotiation, and gradual submission marked their experience. Some Maya cities never truly submitted. They maintained autonomy in practice even while nominally accepting Spanish authority. Others fought generations of guerrilla resistance before Spanish arms and disease finally broke them. The Maya employed strategies that frustrated Spanish conquest patterns. They avoided pitched battles after learning that Spanish cavalry and steel weapons dominated open combat. Instead, they attacked from ambush, struck supply lines, and withdrew into terrain where horses could not follow. They made the jungle itself a weapon against the invaders. Maya political fragmentation, usually considered a weakness, became a strength in this context. The Spanish could not achieve a single decisive victory that collapsed an empire. Each city-state required separate conquest. Each alliance required separate negotiation. The process exhausted Spanish resources and patience. The wealth extracted from Maya lands never matched the treasures of Mexico or Peru. The cost-benefit calculation of conquest looked unfavorable compared to other regions. Disease still devastated Maya populations. Smallpox epidemics swept through the peninsula in the 1520s and 1530s. Subsequent waves of measles, typhus, and influenza followed. Population collapses similar to those in Mexico occurred. But the Maya world remained more rural and dispersed than the dense urban centers of the Aztec Empire. This dispersion may have slowed disease transmission somewhat, allowing survival rates higher than in central Mexico. The Spanish conquest of Maya lands also faced competition from other indigenous peoples. Groups from central Mexico allied with the Spanish carved out their own territories in Maya regions. Tlaxcalan warriors who accompanied Spanish expeditions sometimes established their own settlements. The political landscape became incredibly complex, with Spanish, various Maya groups, and Mexican indigenous groups all pursuing different agendas. Religious conversion of the Maya proceeded slowly and incompletely. Franciscan and Dominican friars established missions throughout the peninsula. They learned Maya languages and attempted systematic conversion. But Maya religious practices proved resilient. Superficial acceptance of Christianity often masked continued traditional worship. Syncretic practices combined Christian and Maya elements in ways that persisted for generations. The most famous example of Maya resistance to cultural conquest came with the books. Maya civilization had developed sophisticated writing systems. Codices recorded their history, astronomy, religion, and knowledge. Spanish friars, viewing these as pagan texts, systematically destroyed them. Diego de Landa, a Franciscan friar, personally oversaw the burning of dozens of Maya codices in 1562. Only 4 Maya codices survive today, fragments of a literary tradition largely erased. Yet Maya knowledge survived in other forms. Descendants preserved oral traditions. Some texts were transcribed into Latin alphabet during the colonial period, creating documents like the Popol Vuh, the Quiche Maya creation narrative. Architecture and inscriptions survived because they could not be easily destroyed. The jungle reclaimed many Maya cities, hiding them from Spanish eyes and preserving them for future discovery. Economic exploitation of Maya lands differed from other conquered regions. The Yucatan lacked the gold and silver that drove conquests elsewhere. Instead, the Spanish established encomiendas extracting indigenous labor. They forced Maya to work on Spanish estates producing crops for export. Cotton, cacao, and later henequen became commercial products. The Maya provided the labor while Spanish encomenderos claimed the profits. Rebellion marked the colonial period. Maya uprisings occurred regularly as populations resisted tribute demands, forced labor, and Spanish authority. The most significant was the Tzeltal Maya Revolt of 1712, nearly 2 centuries after first contact. Thousands of Maya united against Spanish rule. The rebellion required military expeditions from central Mexico to suppress. It demonstrated that Maya resistance never fully ended. The conquest of the Maya world reveals different patterns than the falls of the Aztec and Inca empires. No single event marked Maya defeat. No dramatic siege or captured emperor symbolized their loss. Instead, the Maya experienced gradual, incomplete, and contested subjugation. Some regions submitted quickly. Others fought for generations. A few maintained practical independence for over a century and a half. Geography played a crucial role. The mountainous highlands of Guatemala and the dense jungles of the Yucatan provided defensive advantages. The Maya exploited these advantages effectively. The dispersion of population and political power across numerous city-states created redundancy that empire structures lacked. Decapitate an empire and it collapses. But city-states could survive the fall of neighbors and continue resistance. The Spanish eventually claimed victory across Maya lands, but the victory remained incomplete. Colonial control focused on major settlements and productive regions. Remote areas saw little Spanish presence. Maya communities in these areas maintained traditional practices and governance structures with minimal outside interference. The Spanish lacked resources to occupy and control every village and town. The Maya experience also highlights an important reality about Spanish conquest. The dramatic falls of Tenochtitlan and Cusco were exceptional rather than typical. Most indigenous peoples experienced prolonged, messy, incomplete conquests. Spanish claims of control often exceeded reality on the ground. Paper declarations of sovereignty meant little in regions where Spanish soldiers rarely appeared. The costs of conquering the Maya discouraged other potential conquistadors. The Montejo family spent fortunes and decades on the project. They gained lands and encomiendas, but never achieved wealth comparable to Cortés or Pizarro. Young conquistadors seeking quick fortunes looked elsewhere. The Maya world attracted fewer Spanish settlers than other regions for generations. This relative neglect had consequences. Spanish cultural influence penetrated less deeply in Maya regions than in central Mexico. Indigenous languages remained dominant. Traditional practices survived more intact. The Maya retained more cultural continuity through the colonial period than peoples who experienced swifter, more complete conquests. The conquest of the Maya world extended from 1517 to 1697, a span of 180 years. During this period, Spain conquered vast territories elsewhere in the Americas. Yet these Maya peoples, without horses, steel, or gunpowder, maintained resistance longer than most others. Their experience reminds us that indigenous peoples were not simply passive victims of conquest. They fought, adapted, negotiated, and survived in ways that complicated and sometimes defeated Spanish ambitions. The Maya world fell slowly, incompletely, and with fierce resistance that lasted generations. The rumors of a golden kingdom to the south. While conquistadors fought in Mexico, others explored the coasts of South America seeking new opportunities. They sailed from Panama, the Spanish outpost established in 1519 on the narrow isthmus connecting the continents. From there, ships could access the Pacific Ocean, opening new territories for exploration and conquest. The men who gathered in Panama heard rumors. Indigenous peoples spoke of a wealthy kingdom to the south, a civilization rich in gold and silver, an empire waiting to be conquered. Vasco Núñez de Balboa led the first European crossing of the Isthmus of Panama in 1513. He fought through jungle, forded rivers, and negotiated with indigenous groups. When he finally reached the Pacific shore, he waded into the water fully armored and claimed the entire ocean for Spain. The gesture was absurd in its grandiosity, but legally significant. Spain now claimed rights to whatever lay across this new ocean. The crossing proved that South America extended far south of previously explored regions. It also revealed that a narrow strip of land separated two great oceans. This geography had strategic importance. Ships from the Caribbean could reach the Pacific coast without sailing around the entire continent. Panama became the launching point for expeditions southward. Among those early expeditions was Francisco Pizarro. Born illegitimate around 1478 in Extremadura, Pizarro came from poverty. He crossed to the Americas as a soldier seeking fortune. He participated in Balboa's expedition. He learned to endure hardship, to navigate politics among conquistadors, and to recognize opportunity when it appeared. The rumors of a southern kingdom intrigued him deeply. In 1524, Pizarro partnered with Diego de Almagro and a priest named Hernando de Luque. The three formed a company to explore and potentially conquer the lands south of Panama. Pizarro would command. Almagro would recruit and supply. Luque would provide financing and serve as their representative in Panama. The arrangement was formalized in contracts with shares of future profits carefully delineated. The first expedition in 1524 was a disaster. Pizarro sailed south along the Colombian coast with about 80 men. They encountered hostile peoples, difficult terrain, and disease. Food ran short. The men grew sick. Almagro arrived with reinforcements but lost an eye in a skirmish with indigenous warriors. After months of suffering with little to show for it, the expedition limped back to Panama. Pizarro had found nothing to justify the effort, but he had heard more stories. Indigenous peoples spoke of an empire called Tawantinsuyu, a kingdom in the mountains with cities built of stone, rulers who wore gold and silver, armies that numbered in the thousands. The stories grew more detailed with each telling. Pizarro became convinced that something significant lay further south. He needed to try again. The second expedition in 1526 started with similar struggles. Coastal regions offered little encouragement. Swamps, hostile populations, and tropical diseases eroded the force. Almagro returned to Panama for more supplies and men. Pizarro pushed forward with a corps of the most committed explorers. His pilot, Bartolomé Ruiz, sailed ahead and encountered something remarkable. Ruiz intercepted a large balsa wood raft under sail. The raft carried merchants, gold and silver ornaments, elaborate textiles, and ceramic vessels of sophisticated design. The merchants wore fine clothes and displayed no fear of the Spanish. Through gestures and interpreters, they explained they came from a great kingdom to the south. They traded along the coast, bringing goods from the mountains to exchange with coastal peoples. This encounter transformed Spanish understanding. These were not simple tribal peoples. This raft represented a civilization with commerce, craftsmanship, and organization. The gold and silver ornaments, though modest in quantity, suggested larger sources inland. Pizarro sent Ruiz back to Panama with samples while he waited with a small group on an island called Gallo. The governor of Panama, Pedro de los Rios, grew tired of Pizarro's expensive expeditions that produced little return. He sent ships to retrieve Pizarro and his men, ordering them to return. This moment could have ended the quest for the Inca Empire. But Pizarro refused. In a famous gesture, he drew a line in the sand with his sword. He pointed south and said that way led to wealth and glory. He pointed north and said that way led to poverty in Panama. He invited his men to choose. 13 men crossed the line to join Pizarro. History remembers them as the famous 13, or the 13 of the famous Gallo. These men, committing to Pizarro despite orders to return, became legends in conquest lore. Their names survive: Bartolome Ruiz, Cristobal de Peralta, Pedro de Candia, Domingo de Soraluz, Nicolas de Ribera, Francisco de Cuellar, Alonso de Molina, Pedro Alcon, Garcia de Jaén, Anton de Carrion, Alonso Briseno, Martin de Paz, and Juan de Torre. Pizarro and his 13 companions waited on the island for 7 months while political maneuvering occurred in Panama. Finally, Almagro secured permission for one more exploration before final abandonment of the project. A ship arrived to collect Pizarro. The expedition sailed further south than any previous attempt. They reached the northwestern coast of modern Ecuador. There they found undeniable evidence of the civilization they sought. Coastal towns displayed architecture more sophisticated than anything seen in Panama. Aqueducts brought water to settlements. Agricultural terraces climbed hillsides. The populations were larger and more organized. Most significantly, they encountered representatives of the Inca Empire itself. The Spanish landed at Tumbes, a provincial Inca city on the coast. The locals received them cautiously but without immediate hostility. They allowed Spanish representatives to visit the town. The Spanish saw stone buildings, temples, and clear evidence of centralized authority. They saw llamas, animals unknown in the north. They saw gold and silver worked into jewelry and decorations. They finally had confirmation. A wealthy empire existed in the mountains to the south. Pizarro gathered what information he could through interpreters. The empire was vast. It stretched along the entire mountain range for thousands of miles. The capital lay high in the mountains at a city called Cusco. A single emperor called the Sapa Inca ruled absolutely. The Spanish understood they had found something comparable to the Aztec Empire, or perhaps even greater. The expedition returned to Panama in 1528. Pizarro now had evidence to present. He carried gold ornaments, textiles, and 2 young indigenous men who could learn Spanish and serve as translators. He also carried stories of a vast empire ripe for conquest. But the governor remained skeptical. Pizarro had spent years and considerable resources with limited results. The governor denied authorization for a conquest expedition. Pizarro made a bold decision. He would travel to Spain and petition the king directly. In 1528, he sailed for Europe. He brought his evidence, his 2 indigenous interpreters, and his brother Hernando Pizarro to help make his case. The journey itself was risky. Pizarro was an aging, illegitimate commoner with limited education and no court connections. He faced competition from others seeking royal favor and support. But Pizarro had timing on his side. News of Cortés's conquest of Mexico had electrified Spain. The wealth flowing back from New Spain impressed everyone. King Charles V was embroiled in expensive European wars. He desperately needed new sources of revenue. The prospect of another wealthy empire falling to Spanish arms appealed to him enormously. Pizarro's simple directness may have helped his case. He made no elaborate arguments. He simply showed the evidence, told his story, and requested authorization. The gold ornaments, though modest, suggested much larger sources. The textiles demonstrated sophisticated craftsmanship. The accounts from the indigenous interpreters confirmed an organized empire. The king saw potential for enormous gains. In July 1529, Charles V signed the Capitulation of Toledo. This document granted Pizarro extraordinary powers and titles. He would be governor, captain general, and adelantado of Peru, as the Spanish called the region. He received rights to conquer and colonize all lands 200 leagues south of Panama. He gained authority to found cities, distribute lands, and administer justice. In exchange, the crown would receive 1/5 of all treasure and precious metals collected. The capitulation carefully divided rights among the expedition partners. Pizarro received the most prestigious titles. Almagro was named commander of Tumbes and received lesser honors. The division planted seeds of future conflict. Almagro felt slighted. The disparity in rewards would later spark civil wars among the conquistadors, but for now, all focused on the conquest itself. Pizarro returned to Panama in 1530 as a legal conqueror with royal backing. He recruited soldiers and gathered supplies. His brothers joined him. Hernando, Juan, and Gonzalo Pizarro all signed on for the expedition. Other men who would become famous or infamous also joined. Hernando de Soto, an experienced conquistador who participated in Central American campaigns, brought both soldiers and horses. Pedro de Valdivia joined, later to conquer Chile. Sebastian de Benalcazar signed on, eventually conquering Ecuador. By late 1530, Pizarro commanded a force of about 180 men, 37 horses, and several small cannons. Compared to the empire he planned to conquer, the force seemed absurdly small. But Pizarro had learned lessons from Cortés. Superior weapons, horses, and tactics could overcome numerical disadvantages. Indigenous allies could be recruited, political divisions could be exploited, and disease, though the Spanish did not fully understand its role, had already begun devastating Inca populations. In January 1531, the expedition sailed from Panama. They would not return. They sailed toward an empire in crisis, an empire weakened by civil war and disease, an empire unprepared for the particular threat the Spanish represented. Pizarro, now in his 50s, was about to achieve what Cortés had accomplished in Mexico. The rumors of a golden kingdom to the south were about to transform into historical reality. The conquest of the Inca Empire was beginning. Atahualpa and the Inca Civil War. The year was 1527. Deep in the heart of the Andes, in the city that would become Quito, an emperor lay dying. Huayna Capac, 11th ruler of the Inca, felt fever consume him. His skin erupted in pustules. He had never seen this sickness before. None of his people had. The disease had arrived ahead of the strangers, traveling faster than any messenger could run, leaping from village to village along the very roads the Inca had built to bind their empire together. Smallpox had come to Tawantinsuyu. Within days, Huayna Capac was gone. His designated heir, Ninan Cuyochi, followed him into death before messengers could even reach him with news of his succession. Two leaders, struck down by an invisible enemy. The throne stood empty. According to Inca tradition, nobles would select the new ruler from among the emperor's sons. But tradition assumed clear succession. This was chaos. Two sons emerged as claimants. Huáscar controlled Cusco, the sacred capital, heart of the empire. He had legitimacy, the support of the traditional nobility, the blessing of the ancient city. But his half-brother Atahualpa commanded something more immediately powerful, the army. For years, Atahualpa had campaigned in the north with his father, testing himself in battle, earning the fierce loyalty of hardened warriors. These men had just completed the conquest of new territories. They were victorious, they were united, and they believed in their general. The empire tore itself apart. This was not a brief succession dispute. This was total war, spanning 5 years, ravaging the realm from end to end. Huáscar struck first, attempting to capture Quito and eliminate his rival. Early battles went his way. Atahualpa was even briefly captured near Tomabamba. But the northern general escaped, rallied his forces, and turned the tide. Atahualpa's commanders Chalcuchamac and Quisquis proved brilliant tacticians. They pushed south, defeating Huáscar's armies in battle after battle. Cities burned. Thousands perished. The civil war became increasingly brutal as desperation mounted on both sides. Huáscar grew paranoid. Some sources claim he ordered the deaths of nobles who had escorted his father's body, suspecting them of disloyalty. Whether true or exaggerated, the story reveals how trust collapsed within the empire. Atahualpa's forces showed no mercy. They were fighting not just for their leader, but for their own survival. Defeat meant execution. By early 1532, the Northern Army had reached the outskirts of Cusco itself. At Quipaipan, just miles from the capital, the final confrontation occurred. Huáscar's army crumbled. The emperor himself was taken prisoner. Cusco fell. Atahualpa had won. But the victory was hollow. The empire that the victorious general now ruled was exhausted, divided, traumatized. Entire populations had been displaced, agricultural systems disrupted. The carefully maintained balance that allowed Tawantinsuyu to function lay in ruins. Many provinces felt little loyalty to either brother. Some even welcomed the chaos as opportunity. Old grievances surfaced. Conquered peoples who had chafed under Inca rule saw their moment. And then there was the disease. Smallpox had not stopped with Huayna Capac. It continued its rampage through populations with no immunity. Studies suggest that between 50 and 90% of those exposed contracted the virus. Perhaps half of those perished. The epidemic struck the communication network that held the empire together. The Chasqui runners, who could cover vast distances, carrying messages from Cusco to the furthest provinces, fell ill and ceased to function. Information stopped flowing. Provincial governors lost contact with the center. No one knew what was happening beyond their immediate region. The empire, so recently the most powerful state in the Western Hemisphere, stood fractured and vulnerable. Atahualpa established his headquarters at Cajamarca, resting his army at nearby hot springs, savoring his triumph. He knew strangers had landed on the coast. Reports had reached him of bearded men with strange animals and weapons. But what threat could they pose? They numbered fewer than 200. His army counted tens of thousands of battle-tested veterans. The timing could not have been more catastrophic. As Atahualpa prepared to enter Cusco in triumph, to claim the throne he had won through blood and strategy, those strangers were marching inland. They were coming to Cajamarca, and they had no intention of negotiating. The trap at Cajamarca, November 15th, 1532. Francisco Pizarro and his men entered the town of Cajamarca to find it eerily empty. The normal inhabitants, some 2,000 souls, had vanished on Atahualpa's orders. The Spanish-occupied buildings surrounding the central plaza. They could see the Inca encampment on the heights above the valley. Firelight revealed the scale of the host gathered there. Chroniclers would later estimate 80,000 warriors, though modern historians suggest the number was somewhat smaller. Regardless of the exact count, the Spanish were outnumbered by at least 400 to 1. Pizarro faced an impossible situation. Advance into the mountains against that army, suicide. Retreat back through the narrow passes to the coast, equally suicidal. Any sign of weakness would invite attack. The Spanish might be hunted down in those mountain defiles by their technological advantages neutralized by terrain and numbers. That night, Pizarro gathered his officers and proposed something audacious. He would invite Atahualpa to meet him in the plaza, and there, surrounded by tens of thousands of Inca warriors, he would capture the emperor himself. His men thought he was insane. Some contemporary accounts claim men wept with fear. A few lost control of their bodily functions. But Pizarro had precedent. He had heard how his distant cousin Hernán Cortés had captured Montezuma in Mexico. That gambit had worked, at least initially. A captured emperor might be controlled, a leaderless army might dissolve. It was a desperate plan. But they were desperate men. The next day, a messenger arrived from Atahualpa. The emperor agreed to visit the Spanish in their lodgings. He would come that very afternoon. His intentions remain debated by historians. Was this confidence born of overwhelming military superiority? Was it curiosity about the strangers? Or did Atahualpa plan his own trap, believing he would capture or eliminate these interlopers? Late in the afternoon, the procession began. First came attendants sweeping the road. Then hundreds of nobles in ceremonial dress, many wearing gold and silver ornaments. The emperor himself rode on a golden litter carried by 80 high-ranking courtiers dressed in vivid blue livery. The litter was lined with parrot feathers and partially covered in silver. It glittered in the fading light. Behind him came thousands more attendants. Most were unarmed, carrying only ceremonial battle axes meant for show. This was a display of majesty, not a military formation. Pizarro had made a crucial calculation. In what appeared a gesture of goodwill, Atahualpa had left the bulk of his army outside the city walls. He entered with perhaps 7,000 followers, nearly all unarmed. The Spanish remained hidden in the buildings surrounding the plaza at the procession. As the procession filled the square, a Dominican friar named Vicente de Valverde emerged. Through an interpreter, he delivered what became known as the requerimiento, a formal demand that Atahualpa accept Christianity and submit to Spanish authority. The exchange that followed entered legend. Valverde offered Atahualpa a Bible. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say the emperor threw it to the ground. Others claim he examined it with curiosity before setting it aside. Regardless, his rejection was clear. He would be no man's tributary. Pizarro had his pretext. He gave the signal. A cannon roared from the fortress. Spanish soldiers erupted from every building surrounding the plaza, screaming their battle cry, "Santiago!" Cavalry charged into the packed square. The sound alone was terrifying. These people had never seen horses. The animals seemed like monsters. Gunfire cracked, trumpets blared, steel swords rose and fell. The square became a killing ground. Panicked, unarmed attendants tried to flee. but they were pressed too tightly together. The plaza walls trapped them. Spanish cavalry and infantry cut them down systematically. The massacre lasted perhaps 2 hours. Between 2,000 and 10,000 Inca nobles and attendants perished. Not a single Spanish soldier was seriously injured. Pizarro himself forced through the crowd toward Atahualpa's litter. The emperor's bearers, even as their companions died around them, refused to drop their burden or flee. Spanish accounts note their courage. When one bearer fell, another immediately took his place. They held the litter aloft until they were physically incapable of doing so. Only when the last bearers collapsed did Atahualpa's litter tip and fall. Pizarro grabbed the emperor personally, dragging him from the wreckage. The Spaniard received the only Spanish casualty of the day, a cut to his hand from one of his own men's swords as they fought to reach the emperor. Outside the city, the remainder of the Inca army heard the commotion, but they did not attack. The shock of losing their emperor, their god-king, in a single instant shattered their cohesion. Contemporary accounts describe warriors standing frozen, unable to comprehend what had occurred. How could strangers simply seize the son of the sun? The worldview that structured their entire society had just collapsed. Some fled into the night, others simply waited, paralyzed by uncertainty. Atahualpa was imprisoned in a room near the plaza. The ambush at Cajamarca had succeeded beyond Pizarro's wildest expectations. In less than 2 hours, without losing a single man to enemy action, a band of 168 conquistadors had captured the emperor of the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere. The Inca world would never be the same. The ransom of a king and a broken promise. Atahualpa was no fool. Imprisoned in a room measuring roughly 22 feet by 17 feet, he observed his captors carefully. He saw how their eyes followed every piece of gold his servants brought. He understood their hunger for precious metal ran deeper than military ambition. He noticed how they constantly asked about gold, how they melted down artistic treasures to weigh the metal, how they valued weight over beauty. And so he made them an offer that would become legendary: fill his prison room with gold, once over, high as he could reach, fill 2 additional rooms with silver. In exchange, they would release him. The Spanish agreed immediately. They set a mark on the wall at the height Atahualpa could reach with his upstretched arm, approximately 8 feet. The room would be filled to that line with gold objects. The ransom chamber was ready. Word went out across Tawantinsuyu. From Cusco, from Quito, from every corner of the empire, treasure began to flow toward Cajamarca. Llama trains climbed mountain passes heavily laden. Each animal carried gold vessels, silver ornaments, statues from temples, decorative pieces from palaces. Artistic masterpieces created over generations were stripped from their contexts and transported to satisfy Spanish greed. The Spanish were impatient. They deliberately broke larger pieces into smaller ones, claiming they needed to verify the gold's purity, but actually ensuring the room filled more slowly. They wanted time to secure their position, to call for reinforcements. For months, the treasure accumulated. The amount staggered even the greediest conquistador. Modern historians estimate the ransom reached approximately 6,000 kilograms of gold and twice that in silver. In today's values, perhaps $500 million in raw metal alone, not accounting for the artistic and historical value of the pieces themselves. The artistic loss was incalculable. Ceremonial vessels used in sacred rituals, representations of gods and ancestors, architectural ornaments that had graced the finest buildings in Cusco, all melted down into standardized ingots for easier division and transport. While imprisoned, Atahualpa maintained his authority as best he could. He gave orders. His generals obeyed. But he made a fatal calculation. Learning that Pizarro had threatened to bring his captive brother Huáscar from Cusco to determine which had legitimate claim to the throne, Atahualpa ordered Huáscar's death. He could not risk the Spanish choosing his rival. Huáscar was drowned on the road to Cajamarca. This decision would later be used against him. By July 1533, the ransom rooms were full. The Spanish conducted their weighing and division. 20% went to King Charles of Spain. The remainder was distributed among the conquistadors according to rank. Even the lowest-ranked foot soldiers received shares worth 20 kilograms of gold and 40 of silver. Officers received far more. Pizarro himself claimed the largest portion. But the Spanish had no intention of honoring their agreement. Fear had replaced greed as their dominant emotion. They sat deep in Inca territory, surrounded by a population that vastly outnumbered them. Atahualpa's generals, Chalcuchimac, Quisquis, and Rumiñahui, still commanded armies. Rumors reached the Spanish that these forces were mobilizing. Whether the rumors were true or invented as justification for what followed remains debated. Pizarro decided Atahualpa was too dangerous to release. On August 29, 1533, after a mock trial, the emperor was convicted of multiple charges: the death of his brother Huascar, conspiracy against the Spanish, idolatry, polygamy. The charges were pretexts. The trial was theater. The sentence was death by burning at the stake, the Spanish punishment for heresy. But at the last moment, Vicente de Valverde made one final offer. If Atahualpa converted to Christianity, he would be spared the flames and instead strangled by garrote. Faced with the choice between two methods of execution, Atahualpa chose the quicker death. He accepted baptism, taking the Christian name Juan. Then he was led to the plaza of Cajamarca. A garrote was placed around his neck. The Spanish tightened the cord. The last independent Inca emperor died there, strangled, his ransom paid in full, but his freedom denied. With his death, the centralized structure of the Inca state effectively collapsed. Tawantinsuyu had lost its head. The Spanish had gained unimaginable wealth, but they had also demonstrated that no agreement with them could be trusted. The precedent was set. In the Spanish conquest, promises meant nothing. Only force mattered. The march on Cusco and Manco Inca's rebellion. With Atahualpa dead, the Spanish faced a choice. They could consolidate their coastal holdings and be content with the massive ransom they had extracted, or they could march inland, seize the Inca capital, and attempt to control the entire empire. For men like Pizarro, there was never really a question. On November 15, 1533, nearly a year after entering Cajamarca, the Spanish entered Cusco. The city that had been described to them in odd terms appeared magnificent, even after the depredations of civil war. Stone buildings fitted with precision that still amazes engineers today, golden sheets that once covered the Temple of the Sun, though most had already been stripped for Atahualpa's ransom, streets laid out with geometric precision. This was a capital worthy of an empire. But the Spanish did not enter Cusco as conquerors alone. They came with an Inca prince named Manco. The son of Huayna Capac, half-brother to both Atahualpa and Huascar, Manco saw opportunity in chaos. He had cooperated with the Spanish against Atahualpa's generals, helping them defeat Quisquis and secure the highland route to Cusco. In December 1533, with Spanish support, Manco was formally crowned Sapa Inca. Golden fringe descended across his forehead. The ceremony was traditional. The power was illusory. Pizarro had created a puppet ruler. Through Manco, he could claim legitimacy, could present Spanish control as continuation rather than conquest. Indigenous labor could be directed, resources extracted. The fiction of Inca authority would mask Spanish domination. At first, Manco seems to have believed the arrangement could work. Perhaps he thought he could manipulate the Spanish as they thought they were manipulating him. Perhaps he genuinely hoped for a partnership. That illusion shattered quickly. Gonzalo and Juan Pizarro, Francisco's younger brothers, showed Manco nothing but contempt. They looted his household. They took his wives. Contemporary accounts describe physical abuse. When Manco protested, Gonzalo had him chained. The puppet emperor was treated as a captive. In early 1536, Manco managed to escape Cusco. The Spanish had granted him permission for a religious pilgrimage, believing they had broken his spirit. Instead, he gathered sacred objects and fled to the Yucay Valley. There, in April, he raised his standard. Warriors flocked to him from across Tawantinsuyu. Here, finally, was a legitimate Sapa Inca calling for resistance. Not a civil war between rival claimants, but a war of liberation against foreign invaders. The response was massive. Sources vary, but most agree Manco assembled an army numbering at least 100,000. Some estimates suggest twice that. On May 6, 1536, this enormous force descended on Cusco. The siege of Cusco had begun. The Spanish garrison numbered fewer than 200 Europeans plus several thousand indigenous allies, mostly groups who had suffered under Inca rule and saw the Spanish as useful tools against their former oppressors. Against Manco's host, they were vastly outnumbered. The Inca struck first at Sacsayhuaman, the massive fortress overlooking the city. They seized it on May 5th, the day before the main assault. From that elevated position, they rained projectiles down into Cusco itself. Sling stones whistled through the air, burning arrows wrapped in cotton soaked with pitch set thatched roofs ablaze. Fire became as dangerous as combat. Entire quarters of the city burned. The Spanish fought not just warriors, but flames, desperately trying to prevent Cusco from becoming an inferno. For days, smoke choked the valley. The Inca controlled most of the city. Spanish defenders barricaded themselves in two large stone buildings facing each other across the main plaza, the halls of Suntur Huasi and Hatun Cancha. From these strong points, they launched desperate counterattacks. Spanish cavalry, when it could maneuver, proved devastatingly effective. The psychological impact of mounted warriors charging through narrow streets scattered Inca formations. But the siege continued. May became June, June became July. The Spanish sent riders seeking help. Most were intercepted and overcome. Francisco Pizarro in Lima, learning of the siege, sent 2 relief columns. Both were ambushed and destroyed by Inca forces under General Quiso Yupanqui. Manco's strategy seemed sound. Cut off the Spanish garrisons, starve them out. Wait for disease and despair to do their work. But he faced problems of his own. His massive army consisted largely of farmers conscripted for military service. The agricultural calendar did not pause for sieges. If these men did not return to plant and harvest, their families would starve. As summer progressed, warriors began to drift away, not from cowardice, but from necessity. Feeding 100,000 soldiers in one location strained even the Inca logistics system. The Spanish, desperate, decided they could not wait to be starved out. Hernando Pizarro, Francisco's half-brother and the most capable military commander among them, organized a counterattack. The target, Sacsayhuaman itself, on horseback, uphill, against a fortress held by thousands of determined defenders, the assault seemed suicidal. But on the night of May 18th, Spanish cavalry and indigenous allies stormed the fortress. The battle for Sacsayhuaman raged for days. Juan Pizarro, leading the assault, was struck in the head by a sling stone and later died from his wounds. But the Spanish pressed their advantage. They had better armor, superior close combat weapons, and most crucially, they were fighting for their lives with no possibility of retreat. The Inca defenders fought with astonishing courage. When the Spanish breached the outer walls, warriors retreated to the towers and fought to the last man. Some, seeing defeat inevitable, hurled themselves from the walls rather than be captured. Finally, Sacsayhuaman fell. With the fortress retaken, the Spanish could prevent it from being used as a bombardment platform. The siege continued into early 1537, but the momentum had shifted. Manco withdrew his main force to Ollantaytambo, a stronghold northwest of Cusco. In January 1537, Hernando Pizarro pursued him with 70 cavalry and 4,000 allied infantry. At Ollantaytambo, Manco demonstrated sophisticated tactical thinking. He had fortified the natural defenses, adding terraced walls that negated the cavalry's advantage. He had diverted the Vilcanota River, flooding the approaches and turning excellent cavalry terrain into marshland. When the Spanish attacked, they found themselves unable to advance. Their horses floundered in mud. Inca warriors rained projectiles from protected positions above. For once, the Spanish were forced to retreat in disorder. But even this victory could not save Manco's cause. A column of Spanish reinforcements led by Diego de Almagro, returning from a failed expedition to Chile, arrived at Cusco. Manco could not face 3 Spanish forces simultaneously. In April 1537, he abandoned Ollantaytambo and withdrew deeper into the mountains. He established a new capital at Vilcabamba in the cloud forests northwest of Cusco. There, in that remote region, the Neo-Inca state would survive for another 35 years, a thorn in Spanish side, a reminder that conquest was not complete. Manco himself lived until 1544 when he was slain by Spanish refugees he had sheltered. His sons would continue the resistance until 1572. But the siege of Cusco had been the last realistic chance to expel the invaders. The opportunity passed. The Spanish hold on Peru, though challenged, would never again be seriously threatened. The conquistadors, at war with themselves. Victory against the Inca was not the end of violence in Peru. In fact, some of the bloodiest conflicts in the conquest era occurred not between Spanish and indigenous peoples, but between the conquistadors themselves. Gold had brought them together. Gold would tear them apart. The split began with Diego de Almagro. He had been Pizarro's partner in the initial expeditions, sharing the risks and the dreams of conquest. But when it came time to divide the spoils, Pizarro claimed the richest territories. Almagro was granted lands to the south, a governorship that encompassed what is now Chile. He led an expedition south in 1535, hoping to find wealth comparable to what Pizarro had seized in Peru. Instead, he found hardship. The expedition crossed the Andes in winter, losing men to exposure and altitude. The Chilean territories they reached were inhabited by the Mapuche, who proved far more resistant to conquest than the centralized Inca state had been. After 2 brutal years, Almagro returned to Peru empty-handed and bitter. He found the Spanish garrison at Cusco under siege by Manco Inca. Almagro relieved the siege, but instead of cooperating with Hernando and Gonzalo Pizarro, he seized control of the city himself. He claimed Cusco fell within his governorship, not Francisco Pizarro's. The dispute escalated. Francisco Pizarro marched from Lima with an army. Battle seemed inevitable, but negotiations resulted in a temporary peace. Almagro agreed to leave Cusco. The peace lasted months, not years. In April 1538, at the Battle of Las Salinas just outside Cusco, forces loyal to Pizarro met Almagro's army. The battle was brief but bloody. Spanish fought Spanish with the same ferocity they had shown against indigenous forces. Almagro's troops, exhausted from their Chilean expedition and demoralized by betrayals, broke quickly. Almagro himself was captured. Despite his years of partnership with Pizarro, despite his crucial role in the conquests, Diego de Almagro was convicted of rebellion and executed by garrote in July 1538. His death did not end the conflict. It inflamed it. Almagro's followers, known as the Men of Chile, found themselves marginalized. They had risked everything, endured terrible hardships, and received nothing but poverty and contempt from Pizarro's faction. They blamed Francisco Pizarro personally for their dead leader. On June 26, 1541, a group of 20 men of Chile forced their way into Pizarro's palace in Lima. The aging conquistador, now in his 60s, fought them with his sword. But he was overwhelmed. The assassins ran him through multiple times. Francisco Pizarro, who had captured an empire, died on the floor of his own house at the hands of his former companions. His death plunged Peru into civil war. Diego de Almagro the Younger, the executed leader's son, claimed the governorship. Francisco Pizarro's brothers and supporters rejected this claim. The king's representative, Cristobal Vaca de Castro, arrived from Spain to find chaos. He sided with the Pizarro faction and raised an army. At the Battle of Chupas in September 1542, the royal forces defeated Almagro the Younger. He was captured and, like his father, executed. But the king's representative discovered he could not control Peru either. The conquistadors resented any authority that limited their power over indigenous populations or challenged their encomiendas, the land grants that came with the labor of the people living on them. When the Spanish crown issued the new laws in 1542, attempting to protect indigenous peoples and limit the encomienda system, Peru exploded again. Gonzalo Pizarro, youngest of the Pizarro brothers, led a rebellion against royal authority itself. For 4 years, from 1544 to 1548, Gonzalo Pizarro effectively ruled Peru as an independent warlord, defying the crown that had authorized his brother's conquests. He defeated and overthrew the king's representative, the Viceroy Blasco Núñez Vela, in battle in 1546. For a brief moment, it seemed Gonzalo might actually succeed in establishing an independent kingdom in Peru, with himself as ruler. But the crown sent a new representative, Pedro de la Gasca, who proved more skilled at politics than warfare. La Gasca gradually won over Gonzalo's supporters with promises of pardons and rewards. Gonzalo's army melted away through desertion. At the Battle of Zaquijaguana in April 1548, facing forces vastly superior in number, Gonzalo surrendered. He was executed the next day. The conquistadors had turned on each other with savage determination. Pizarro dead, Almagro dead. Almagro the Younger dead. Gonzalo Pizarro dead. Hundreds of Spanish soldiers perished in these internecine conflicts. Thousands more indigenous peoples caught in the crossfire. The violence demonstrated a fundamental truth about the conquest. The men who carried it out were motivated by individual ambition, not national glory or religious mission. When those ambitions conflicted, they killed each other as readily as they had overthrown empires. Only when the Spanish crown finally established effective royal authority in the 1560s did the cycle of rebellion and civil war begin to subside. By then, a generation of conquistadors had passed. The age of the independent adventurer was over. The age of colonial administration had begun. The sprawling frontier, Chile, Colombia, and the Amazon. While Pizarro and his followers fought over Peru, other conquistadors pushed into new territories. The conquest of the Americas was not a single unified campaign, but dozens of separate expeditions, each led by men seeking wealth and glory. Some found riches, most found hardship, a few found death, and one discovered a river that would change maps forever. In 1540, Pedro de Valdivia led an expedition from Peru into the territory now called Chile. Almagro's earlier expedition had failed there, but Valdivia believed persistence would succeed where Almagro had not. He founded Santiago in February 1541 and began pushing south. He encountered the Mapuche, indigenous peoples whose decentralized political structure and warrior culture made them nearly impossible to conquer permanently. The Mapuche did not have emperors who could be captured, no capitals that could be seized. Each community fought independently. When defeated, they retreated, regrouped, and returned. The Spanish found themselves fighting an endless guerrilla war. In 1553, at the Battle of Tucapel, the Mapuche lured Valdivia into an ambush. He was captured along with his men. What happened next entered both Spanish nightmare and Mapuche legend. Valdivia was made to witness as his companions were executed. Then, according to some accounts, the Mapuche poured molten gold down his throat, telling him to drink his fill of the metal he so desired. Whether this specific detail is historical or symbolic, the message was clear. The Mapuche rejected Spanish domination entirely. The war in Chile would continue for 300 years, not 3 decades, 3 centuries. The Mapuche maintained their independence longer than any other indigenous group in the Americas, only finally being subdued in the 1880s. The Spanish eventually called the region south of the Biobío River La Frontera, the frontier, acknowledging they could not control it. Farther north, in the lands that would become Colombia, other conquistadors pursued a different dream, El Dorado, the Golden Man. The legend spoke of a chief who covered himself in gold dust and washed it off in a sacred lake while offerings were thrown into the water. Various expeditions searched for this mythical kingdom. In 1536, Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada led an expedition up the Magdalena River into the highlands of what is now Colombia. He encountered the Muisca Confederation, peoples who worked gold with great skill. Quesada conquered the Muisca territories and founded Santa Fe de Bogotá in 1538. Though he found gold, he never located El Dorado. No one did, because the legend was based on a ceremony that had already ceased by the time the Spanish arrived. But the search for El Dorado would drive expeditions across South America for generations, each one convinced the Golden Kingdom lay just beyond the next mountain range. The most extraordinary expedition of this era, however, sought not gold but survival. In 1541, Gonzalo Pizarro led an expedition from Quito into the Amazon basin, searching for the land of cinnamon and gold that rumor placed somewhere to the east. The expedition encountered only jungle, rivers, and starvation. Pizarro sent his second-in-command, Francisco de Orellana, ahead with a smaller group to search for food. Orellana found the current too strong to return against. Instead, he made a decision that would secure his place in history. He would follow the river to wherever it led. For months, Orellana and his men drifted downstream. The river grew wider, tributaries added their flow. They encountered indigenous groups, some friendly, some hostile. They fought battles. They nearly starved. They built new boats when the old ones rotted. And they kept moving east, driven by the current and the hope that the river would eventually reach the sea. On August 26, 1542, after traveling approximately 8 months and 3,000 miles, Orellana's expedition emerged into the Atlantic Ocean. They had completed the first European navigation of the Amazon River, from the Andes to the Atlantic. They had seen wonders, vast floodplains, rivers that stretched beyond the horizon, forests unlike anything in Europe. Orellana claimed to have encountered female warriors, which led him to name the river after the Amazons of Greek legend. Whether he actually encountered matriarchal warrior societies or misinterpreted what he saw remains debated. But the name stuck: the Amazon, the greatest river system on Earth. These expeditions in Chile, Colombia, and the Amazon revealed the limits of Spanish conquest. In decentralized societies like the Mapuche, the conquistador strategy of capturing leaders and ruling through them failed. In vast, underpopulated regions like the Amazon, there were simply too few people and too much territory for the Spanish to control effectively. The pattern that had worked so devastatingly well against the Aztecs and Incas could not be replicated everywhere. Some frontiers remained frontiers. Some peoples resisted successfully. The Spanish Empire in the Americas was vast, but it was never complete. The machinery of empire, laws, viceroys, and the church. The age of conquest gradually gave way to the age of administration. Individual conquistadors with their private armies were replaced by royal officials with bureaucratic authority. The Spanish crown, having authorized the conquests, now had to govern what had been seized. The institutional structure they created would shape Latin America for centuries. In 1535, Spain established the Viceroyalty of New Spain with its capital at Mexico City. In 1542, the Viceroyalty of Peru was created, centered on Lima. These viceroys served as the king's representatives, wielding both executive and judicial authority. They commanded military forces, oversaw royal finances, and administered justice. The conquering captains answered to them or faced consequences. Below the viceroys stretched a complex hierarchy. Audiencias served as both courts and advisory councils. Corregidors governed individual districts. Cabildos functioned as town councils, though their members were inevitably Spanish settlers, not indigenous people. Every position came with detailed instructions from Madrid, specifying duties, limitations, and reporting requirements. The Spanish Empire ran on paperwork. But the crown faced a fundamental problem. How do you control territories 10,000 miles away, where messages take months to arrive? How do you govern settlers who had risked their lives for wealth and now refused to surrender their power? The solution, imperfect but persistent, was the encomienda system. Conquistadors and early settlers received grants of indigenous communities. These encomenderos could demand tribute and labor from their assigned populations. In exchange, they were supposed to protect these people and ensure their Christian instruction. The system legalized exploitation while pretending to provide protection. Encomenderos worked indigenous laborers in mines, on plantations, in workshops. Mortality rates were staggering. Entire communities disappeared within a generation. Yet, the encomienda persisted because it served Spanish interests. It rewarded conquistadors without requiring the crown to pay them. It generated wealth through indigenous labor, and it maintained Spanish control by making settlers dependent on royal land grants. But the system appalled some observers. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar who had himself held an encomienda before renouncing it in horror, became the most vocal critic of Spanish treatment of indigenous peoples. His writings described atrocities in graphic detail. He documented entire populations worked to death. He cataloged methods of torture and execution. His work, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, published in 1552, became one of the most influential texts of the era. Las Casas lobbied the crown relentlessly. He argued that indigenous peoples were rational beings with souls deserving of protection under Spanish law. His efforts contributed to the new laws of 1542. These regulations attempted to phase out the encomienda system, prohibited indigenous slavery, and mandated better treatment of native populations. On paper, they represented a remarkable attempt at reform. In practice, they triggered rebellion. Gonzalo Pizarro's uprising in Peru was explicitly motivated by resistance to the new laws. Settlers throughout the Americas protested. The crown, facing the prospect of losing its American territories entirely, backed down. The most threatening provisions were suspended or left unenforced. The encomienda continued, modified but intact. The Catholic Church played a contradictory role in this colonial system. Missionaries, particularly Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits, worked to convert indigenous populations. Some, like Las Casas, genuinely tried to protect their charges from settler violence. They established missions where indigenous people could live under church rather than secular authority. They documented native languages, created dictionaries and grammars, and preserved cultural knowledge even as they worked to erase indigenous religions. But the church was also complicit in conquest. Priests blessed conquistador expeditions. The requerimiento that preceded so many battles was delivered by clergy. The Inquisition established offices in the Americas, prosecuting heresy and suppressing indigenous religious practices. A rigid racial hierarchy emerged, codified by law and reinforced by custom. At the top stood peninsulares, people born in Spain itself. Just below them were criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas. They possessed wealth and education but were excluded from the highest offices, which remained reserved for those born in Spain. Below them were mestizos, people of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry. Then came indigenous peoples, legally subjects of the crown but practically subordinated in every way. At the bottom were enslaved Africans, imported in increasing numbers as indigenous populations collapsed. The system was called the casta system, and it determined every aspect of life: where you could live, whom you could marry, what work you could perform, whether you paid taxes. This machinery of empire operated through a combination of force, law, and ideology. Military garrisons enforced order. Royal courts adjudicated disputes according to Spanish law. And the church provided the ideological justification for the entire system, teaching that Spanish rule, however harsh, brought salvation to pagan peoples. It was a comprehensive system of control, designed not just to extract wealth, but to permanently transform the societies it conquered. The conquistadors had toppled empires in years. The colonial administrators who followed them would shape the resulting societies for 3 centuries. The Columbian Exchange, a transatlantic revolution. The conquest of the Americas triggered an exchange of unprecedented scope. Plants, animals, diseases, and peoples moved between hemispheres, transforming ecosystems and societies on both sides of the Atlantic. Historians call this the Columbian Exchange, after Columbus, who initiated it. But exchange implies equality. What occurred was often more like invasion, with consequences that reshaped the world. The most devastating element of the exchange was disease. Europeans brought smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, bubonic plague, and numerous other pathogens to populations with no immunity. The demographic catastrophe that followed remains difficult to fully comprehend. In 1491, the Americas held between 50 and 100 million people. By 1600, that population had collapsed to perhaps 5 to 10 million. Some regions lost 90% or more of their inhabitants within a century of contact. The numbers are so staggering they seem almost abstract. To make them concrete, consider what happened on Hispaniola, the first major Spanish colony. When Columbus arrived in 1492, the island supported perhaps 300,000 Taino people. By 1548, fewer than 500 indigenous people remained alive on the entire island. Similar patterns repeated across the Caribbean, in Mexico, in Peru. Everywhere Europeans established control. The diseases moved faster than the conquistadors themselves. Smallpox reached the Aztec Empire before Cortés's main assault on Tenochtitlan, weakening the defenders. It arrived in the Inca Empire before Pizarro even landed, triggering the civil war that divided the realm. Indigenous peoples developed theories about the diseases. Some believed Spanish weapons or even their presence brought sickness. They were not entirely wrong. The concentration of people around Spanish settlements, the disruption of traditional patterns of life, the forced labor that weakened immune systems, all contributed to disease transmission. Contemporary accounts describe whole villages perishing. Survivors lacked the strength to bury the departed. Fields went unplanted because there were no farmers left to work them. Starvation followed disease, yet the exchange moved in both directions. From the Americas, Europeans acquired crops that would transform their own societies. The potato, native to the Andes, became a staple crop in Europe. Ireland's population exploded in the 18th century based largely on potato cultivation. Maize from Mesoamerica spread across Africa and Asia. Tomatoes, originally from South America, became essential to Italian cuisine. Cacao enabled European chocolate production. Tobacco created an entirely new industry. These crops thrived in Old World climates and soils, sometimes better than in their native regions. The potato could feed more people per acre than wheat or rye. Maize grew in conditions where other grains failed. The biological exchange extended to animals as well. Horses, brought by the Spanish, revolutionized indigenous warfare and hunting practices across the Americas. Plains societies in North America developed horse cultures within generations. Cattle, sheep, and pigs multiplied in American grasslands and forests. These animals provided meat, leather, and labor. But they also competed with native species and transformed landscapes. Pigs, in particular, able to survive in the wild, became invasive species in many regions. From the Americas, Europe gained the turkey, which became a domesticated food source. Few other American animals proved easily domesticable or useful to Europeans. The exchange of precious metals deserves special attention. Spanish extraction of silver, particularly from the mines at Potosi in present-day Bolivia, flooded European markets with currency. Between 1500 and 1800, Spanish America produced an estimated 150,000 tons of silver. This influx caused inflation across Europe, destabilized economies, and financed wars. The silver flowed not just to Spain, but across the globe. Spanish silver coins became the de facto international currency, circulating from Manila to Amsterdam. Much of this silver was extracted through forced indigenous labor under the mita system, a form of rotational labor draft adapted from Inca practices but made far more deadly under Spanish rule. The Columbian exchange also included the forced transportation of millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas. As indigenous populations collapsed, Spanish and Portuguese colonizers turned to Africa for labor. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, approximately 12 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Their labor built the plantation economies of Brazil, the Caribbean, and eventually North America. This human tragedy was another element of the exchange, though calling it exchange obscures the violence and coercion involved. The consequences of the Columbian exchange continue to shape our world. The global distribution of crops means your supermarket carries foods from every inhabited continent. The demographic collapse of indigenous Americans created a population imbalance that took centuries to reverse. The extraction of American wealth financed European development and warfare. Understanding the conquistadors requires understanding they initiated transformations far beyond their immediate military conquests. They were vectors of change that operated at a planetary scale. The Black Legend, La Leyenda Negra, and its critics. No discussion of the Spanish conquest can avoid the Black Legend. This term refers to the narrative, particularly popular in Protestant Northern Europe and later the United States, that Spanish colonization was uniquely brutal, that the conquistadors were especially cruel, that Spanish rule represented tyranny at its worst. The legend emerged during the Reformation and intensified during Spain's conflicts with England and the Netherlands. Protestant propagandists used accounts of Spanish atrocities to paint their Catholic rivals as barbarous. Ironically, many of the most damning descriptions came from Spanish sources themselves. Bartolomé de las Casas's writings, intended to reform Spanish policy, were translated and weaponized by Spain's enemies. His accounts of atrocities, detailed and horrifying, became evidence of Spanish depravity in Protestant propaganda. Engravings depicting Spanish soldiers committing acts of extreme violence circulated widely in Northern Europe. These images shaped perceptions for centuries. The Black Legend contained truths. Spanish conquistadors did commit atrocities, massacres occurred, torture was employed, entire populations were worked to death in mines and plantations. The scale of suffering was immense. Contemporary Spanish sources document these events. Defenders of Spanish colonization cannot simply dismiss the accusations as foreign propaganda. But the legend also obscured important context. First, the Spanish themselves debated the morality of conquest more extensively than any other colonial power of the era. The famous Valladolid debate of 1550-1551 saw Las Casas argue against Juan Ginés de Sepulveda over whether indigenous peoples had souls and rights. No such debate occurred in English, French, or Dutch colonial circles. The Spanish developed legal frameworks intended to protect indigenous peoples. However, inadequately those laws were enforced. The Leyes de Indias, compiled throughout the colonial period, represented the most comprehensive attempt to regulate colonization under law. Second, Every European colonial power committed atrocities. The English in Ireland and later North America employed tactics as brutal as anything the Spanish did. The Dutch in the East Indies, the Portuguese in Africa, the French in their colonies, all engaged in violence and exploitation. The difference was not Spanish uniqueness in cruelty, but Spanish openness in documenting and debating it. Spanish guilt was recorded by Spanish hands, creating an archive that later enemies exploited. Third, the demographic collapse of indigenous populations resulted primarily from disease, not deliberate genocide. This does not absolve the Spanish of responsibility. They created conditions that accelerated disease transmission. They worked populations that needed rest to recover. They disrupted societies in ways that made epidemic disease more lethal. But the die-off was not a planned extermination campaign. No conquistador understood germ theory. They did not deliberately weaponize disease, despite later myths about smallpox-infected blankets. The catastrophe resulted from biological processes the participants could barely comprehend. Modern historians debate the Black legend's accuracy and utility. Some argue it should be abandoned entirely as Protestant propaganda that obscures the complexity of Spanish colonization. Others contend that while the legend may exaggerate Spanish uniqueness, the core accusations of extreme violence and exploitation are well-founded. Spanish conquistadors did topple civilizations through a combination of military force, strategic alliances, disease, and sheer audacity. They established a colonial system that extracted massive wealth while imposing European culture, religion, and governance on indigenous peoples. Whether this was worse than other colonial projects or simply better documented remains a matter of interpretation and sometimes ideology. What cannot be disputed is that the conquest transformed the Americas irreversibly. The societies that existed in 1491 were gone by 1600, replaced by colonial structures that persisted for centuries. Millions died. Cultures were suppressed, or destroyed. And yet, indigenous peoples survived. Their descendants make up large portions of modern Latin American populations. Their influence persists in language, food, customs, and beliefs. The Black legend, whatever its origins and purposes, should not obscure either the suffering inflicted or the resilience demonstrated by those who endured it. Echoes in Stone and Blood, the legacy of the conquistadors. Walk through Mexico City today and you walk on layers of history. Beneath your feet lie the ruins of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital raised by Cortés and his allies. The Metropolitan Cathedral sits atop the Templo Mayor, the Great Pyramid where Aztec priests once performed ceremonies. Colonial buildings line streets that follow the original Aztec grid. The Spanish built their capital directly over the indigenous one, a physical manifestation of conquest. Yet step into that same cathedral and you find the Virgin of Guadalupe, dark-skinned and surrounded by indigenous imagery, a syncretic fusion of Catholic and native symbolism that emerged from the collision of worlds. This blending defines the legacy of the conquistadors in ways the conquerors themselves never imagined. They came to impose European civilization completely. What resulted was something entirely new. Mestizaje, the mixing of Spanish and indigenous peoples, created populations that were neither one nor the other, but something distinct. By the 18th century, people of mixed ancestry formed the majority in many regions. The rigid casta system attempted to categorize and control this mixing, but biology and human behavior defied bureaucratic categories. Languages fused as well. Spanish became the dominant tongue, but it absorbed thousands of words from Nahuatl, Quechua, and other indigenous languages. Words for foods, places, animals, and concepts entered Spanish and from there spread globally. Religion offers perhaps the clearest example of cultural synthesis. The Spanish imposed Catholicism with force. They destroyed temples, burned sacred texts, and punished indigenous religious practices. Yet indigenous beliefs did not disappear. They went underground or merged with Catholic forms. Saints took on attributes of native gods. Christian holidays overlapped with traditional festivals. The result was a distinctly Latin American Catholicism, different from the European version that inspired it. This religious synthesis was not peaceful. It emerged from violence and coercion. But over generations, it became authentic to those who practiced it, neither purely Spanish nor purely indigenous, but genuinely their own. Architecture throughout Latin America reflects this fusion. Colonial buildings use European architectural styles but incorporate indigenous labor techniques and decorative motifs. The great churches of Mexico and Peru were built by indigenous stonemasons who brought their own aesthetic sensibilities to European designs. Spanish colonial law, the Leyes de Indias, remained in force for 3 centuries. These laws created hierarchies based on race and birth. They determined who could hold office, own property, practice trades, yet they also recognized indigenous communities as legal entities with rights to their lands. Spanish courts, however biased, sometimes ruled in favor of indigenous plaintiffs. The system was oppressive, but it was not totalitarian. Space existed for negotiation, resistance, and occasionally justice. The genetic legacy remains visible. Modern DNA studies show that most Latin Americans carry both European and indigenous ancestry, with African contributions in many regions. This genetic mixing reflects the violent reality of conquest, where Spanish men took indigenous women as wives, mistresses, or victims. It also reflects centuries of more voluntary unions between descendants of both groups. Today, Latin America is among the most genetically diverse regions on Earth. The economic structures established during the conquest persisted well into the 20th century. Large estates worked by impoverished laborers, concentration of wealth in the hands of a small elite, extraction of resources for export rather than local development. These patterns have roots in the encomienda and hacienda systems created by the conquistadors and their colonial successors. How do Latin Americans view the conquistadors today? The answer varies dramatically by country, region, and individual perspective. In Mexico, Cortés is generally viewed negatively, seen as a destroyer of indigenous civilization. Mexico City removed his statue decades ago. National identity celebrates indigenous heritage, particularly Aztec, while viewing the Spanish conquest as tragedy and trauma. Yet millions of Mexicans claim Spanish ancestry and celebrate aspects of Spanish cultural heritage. The relationship is complicated. In Peru, the legacy is similarly contested. Some Peruvians emphasize indigenous Inca heritage and view the conquest as catastrophe. Others point to the blending of cultures as the foundation of modern Peruvian identity. In Spain itself, the conquistadors are viewed with ambivalence. Some see them as heroic explorers who spread civilization and Christianity. Others acknowledge the brutality of conquest while arguing it must be understood in historical context. Still others view the entire colonial project as shameful. These debates intensified in 2019 when Mexico's president asked Spain to apologize for the conquest. Spain declined, arguing that both nations were created by those events and share mixed ancestry. Who is there to apologize to whom? The monuments remain. Stone fortresses built by conquistadors still stand across the Americas. Cathedrals built on indigenous ruins continue to hold services. Cities founded in the 16th century are now modern metropolises. The physical legacy is everywhere. The cultural legacy runs deeper. Spanish is the second most spoken language globally by number of native speakers. Latin American literature, music, and art have influenced cultures worldwide. The foods that cross the Atlantic in both directions are now staples of global cuisine. The social structures are slowly changing. Indigenous movements have gained political power in recent decades. In Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, and Mexico, indigenous peoples have been elected to high office. Languages like Quechua and Guarani are being revitalized. The story is not finished. The conquistadors toppled empires in a handful of years, but the people they conquered and their descendants have endured for 5 centuries. They have adapted, resisted, and ultimately shaped the societies that emerged from conquest. The legacy of the conquistadors is not simple triumph or tragedy. It is the complex, often painful process by which different peoples and cultures collided, fought, merged, and created something new. The societies of Latin America today are neither European nor indigenous in the forms those terms meant in 1492. They are the product of that collision, carrying forward elements of both and belonging entirely to neither. The conquistadors changed the world, but the world they created changed them as well and continues to evolve in ways they could never have anticipated. Their echoes remain in stone and blood, in language and belief, in the faces of their descendants who still grapple with their complicated inheritance.